Good morning, everyone. My name is Rowena Arshad. I'm the head of school here at Murray House, and I'm very pleased indeed to welcome all of you. We have a busy morning to look forward to. The speakers, the authors and contributors to the book, and a great read. So if you haven't had your copy yet, I would suggest you do rush along at coffee break to get one. It's not me doing a promo for the book, but I've been reading it. It is a fantastic read, and it's had, of course, good coverage in the press as well. So you can get hold of a copy in the drama room where you had your coffee. And I suspect what our speakers will be sharing with us is not just the lessons from the 50 years, but something about the importance of having data. Data that you can analyze, data that you can learn lessons from. The School Leavers Survey, for example, has been a primary data source for the book, amongst other sources. And the question that I have to ask myself is, in 25 years, would we be able to have a seminar like today? Have we got the data sets in Scotland for people in 25 years to be able to reflect and analyse and learn from? I suspect the speakers might also tell us that these lessons are important to contribute to policy formation based on evidence. And as Scotland moves into Fairer Scotland 2030, I would have thought the lessons from this book really plays into that agenda. And perhaps they might also remind us that whilst it's great to look at policy from other countries, and we must always do that, we should also look at the history of our own data and policies within Scotland and to pick up from that. My own work since coming to Scotland in 1985 have been in various aspects of education, from non-formal to formal, adult education, school, and then now higher education. And in that time, the work has always been to remove structural barriers, structural inequalities that prevent learners from being able to achieve, to vision learning spaces that bring out the best in each of us, and to work with education practitioners to gain a more rounded understanding that it is not just within the classroom, but it is within the community and it is within families that the learning must take place. The principles of comprehensive schooling, and perhaps it would be comprehensive education, where it is education for all and not just a select group, sits well with all of us in this room. We who are in different ways have campaigned for social justice, but also in different ways attempted to dismantle structures that repeatedly discriminate. Before I move on to housekeeping and the order of the morning, I would like to take time to acknowledge one of the authors of the book, who is not with us here today, Professor David Rafe. David is known to, I suspect, all of us in this room. He was the director of the Centre for Educational Sociology twice. Such was his integrity and his passion for the work that he did twice, from 1987 to 2001, and then again from 2010 to 2012. His contribution was deep and wide, from policy developments in Scottish education, but also globally on areas such as youth transitions, from education to the labour market, national qualification frameworks, and access to higher education. I know that his colleagues in CES very much miss him. He's also missed by many of us in this school, across the University of Edinburgh, and many more networks in the UK and worldwide. David passed away unexpectedly a few days after the manuscript was handed in to the publishers, Trentham Books. The book and today's seminar, the fact that you are all here, continues David's work in trying to make a difference in tackling inequalities in schooling. So, for those of you who haven't found the washrooms, they are just out in the corridor. The gents are straight ahead and the ladies to the right of the corridor. There is a Twitter hashtag, which, it was here a minute ago, but it's gone, but it is hashtag 50 years comp SCH. So hopefully if you get onto it once, you'll be able to start tweeting thereafter. Can I say that there are question sheets in your pack, which are these. And I'd like to invite you to submit questions for the panel after coffee. There are two parts to it. The first part is for you to submit, put into the box outside in where you registered, or you can just hand it in to any one of these speakers here, Kathy, Danny, and Linda. And there is a bit at the bottom where you can sort of jot down what it is you asked so that you remember the question, and then you read, because we will ask you to read your question out. A bit like question time. Not that I want to play David Dimbleby, okay? So, now, there is live streaming because we do have people in another room watching this, so there's live streaming. And we also know that there are colleagues who want to be here but cannot be here this morning simply through distance, geography, and so this allows them to be with us at the moment, in the moment. There's also going to be a video archive of the event. So please ensure that when you're asking questions later, there will be roving mics, and so wait for the mic to come to you before you ask the question. The video that's taken is only of the panel members and speakers, and those asking questions may be recorded on audio rather than visual. The crib notes they've put for me here is, so you don't want it recorded, don't ask a question. I don't think we'll follow that rule. There will be some still photographs taken for the CES website, and again, indicate if you don't want your photographs. So you can be shy and say, no, not for me. Okay. Now, I do intend to stick to timing, so I give you warning of that. And Danny asked me whether I was going to sit in the middle in this session. I said, absolutely not. I'm going to sit there because, and you are not to avoid my eye contact. 2 minutes and I will stop you, okay? So, you've had warning. Right, I think that neatly then takes me on to introduce Danny Murphy, who is the primary author of this book, and he will be taking us through the first session. So, Danny.
Well, I'm going to begin by reiterating Lena's welcome. Nice to see so many familiar faces and some not so familiar. Some of you, like me, have lived in comprehensive schools for 40 or more years, and some of you may be a bit younger than that, but young or old, you're very welcome. And thanks from me to the fantastic team that worked together with me on this book, Kathy and Linda, and as Lena mentioned, David, whose contribution is all the way through, improved the quality of what we've done. Thanks also to colleagues in Murray House School of Education, Robbie, Dee Torrance, Sheila Riddell, Annie Florian, and in particular Grace Kong and Colin Campbell, who were the organisational geniuses who kept us in order. And also Mike, honorary member of staff, and Barry at the back, and anyone who's contributed. Our thanks. 27th of October is, of course, the exact 50th birthday of comprehensive schooling in Scotland, and there's a heading of Circular 600, which the then Secretary of State issued with a request that local authorities reorganise their schools on comprehensive lines. Now, although that's the date, it's really just a hook, because we know from our research into the past that Scotland was already moving in that direction. There were comprehensive schools in Scotland long before. And by 1965, only 20% of Scottish schools were not submitting at least some of their pupils for national leaving examinations. Even many of the junior secondaries of the time were. We also know that it took a long time after 27th of October for comprehensive schools to be fully implemented. In fact, we might argue after this morning in our discussions that the principles of comprehensive schooling have not yet been fully implemented. So let's look at some words from the circular. Here's a quote. Quite apart from educational considerations, the Secretary of State believes that a system which segregates children into separate schools is wrong. It's a very strong statement, and a statement with which the majority of people in Scotland agree, as measured in the national debate that we had about our schooling system and education system in 2002-03. And he argued that children would grow up better if they spent their time with a fuller cross-section of the community. And right from the beginning, that was a very important aspect of the comprehensive movement, about developing in all young people a social understanding of the whole community that they were growing up in. And here's another challenge from the circular, that flexible arrangements will ensure that the development of pupils is not held back nor discouraged, and all children will develop a pride in their own achievements. Again, those of us that have worked in these schools know that we've never really managed to achieve that. It's a very high challenge, and one that we aspire to, but didn't manage to make work, or not yet. And that's because, by and large, the circular is from the Make It So School of Management. Here's an impossible task: make it so. And we've spent 50 years trying to make that work. Now, I think, however, we will never make it work, and one of the reasons is because the values that underpin comprehensive education are in constant dynamic tension with each other, and we're constantly called on, whether at national policy level or in the individual classroom, to manage those tensions. And sometimes they create dilemmas for us in terms of what we should do as professional people, or what way we should go forward. And we argue in the book that that's because comprehensive schools as democratic institutions from which no child is turned away. It's very important. No child is turned away. No child is selected out. Every child is welcome. It's a fantastic, positive statement about our democratic system of schooling. But underpinning democracy are these potentially competing values. Liberty is one of them, and we go back to these kind of foundational values. It has a lot of positives, there's some of them there. But if we give too much liberty to liberty, if you like, we can run the risk of damaging equality. And we see that at national state level. Countries that have greater individual liberty, such as the United States, have less equality. But on the other hand, if you force equality, you destroy liberty. And we see that in Stalin's Russia, we see it now in North Korea, and even in these supposed forced equality systems, as we know from Animal Farm, there is great inequality. So we have to accept, in fact, that we're never going to get absolute equality, we're never going to get absolute liberty, that in fact these two great democratic ideals live with each other all the time. They do in our democracy, and they do in our schools, because everyone's in there, and everyone is valued. And that possibly is the most important aspect of equality that we draw out of our analysis. Yes, comprehensive schools have greatly increased opportunity, but most importantly, we've ended up in a situation where every child is equally valued. Now, aspects of the system don't necessarily do that, but that is the aspiration. But where we have equality of outcome, where we ask for equality of outcomes, we may be asking for something that's not possible. And we'll come back to that later in the morning. We also highlight this word, fraternity, what Bernard Crick called the forgotten value of democracy in the 1970s. We hedged a bit around the use of the word. It has a historical gendered meaning, but we think it has a political philosophy meaning that isn't gendered, and that quote from my earlier book, Schooling Scotland, kind of sums it up. Fraternity is about face-to-face. It's about relationships. It's about community. And it's a very important part of democracy, because if we don't have that, what's the point of equality and liberty? You know, these three go together very well. And fraternity often finds the balance. And we argue, in fact, that that's to do with fairness. That in a fraternal situation where you're face-to-face with somebody, it's very difficult to treat somebody unfairly. And that's what happens in our schools on a daily basis, in our school communities, where children are demanding more resources, or we're giving some children more advantages than others. That appears immediately to be unfair. So these are dynamic challenges at the heart of our system. And we wanted to open with those values and those ideas. However, a lot of what's in the book is actually not about the ideas, but about the practice. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues for that next section. First Linda, and then Kathy.
Well, equality is one of the key principles of comprehensive education, and my task is to highlight some of the research on equality associated with comprehensive reforms. I've only got a little bit of time, so I can only highlight a few examples of research, but the book has got so much more. I'm going to summarise these under the same headings as Danny: equality of opportunity, of outcome, and of value. So let's start with equality of opportunity. And can I remind you about the comprehensive reforms, the sequence of them, because the decision to end selection was just the first step. And it then took at least 15 years to reorganise schools along comprehensive lines, added to which the school leaving age was raised from 15 to 16. But within the new comprehensive schools, there was not a common provision of curriculum. It was not open to all, because O grades were really only suitable for a minority of students, and the provision for the so-called non-certificate pupils was quite inadequate. So the next step was to develop a common system of curriculum and assessment open to all pupils, a common entitlement. So the Munn and Dunning reviews in the 1970s led to the standard grade reforms. And these provided a common curriculum, but it was differentiated according to different levels of demand: foundation, general, and credit. And then Action Plan broadened the curriculum with national certificate modules. And higher still, reformed upper secondary education, providing opportunity for all and providing courses from access through to advanced higher. So what was the effect of this opening up of opportunities? Well, piecing together data from the government statistical bulletins, we can show the considerable increase in participation and attainment over this period. Back in the 1960s and 70s, most young people left school at the minimum age of 15 with no qualifications. Now the vast majority stay on at school for some post-compulsory education, and almost all school leavers have got some qualifications. So my first chart is showing staying on rates in S5 and S6. The red and blue trend lines at the top of the chart show the massive increase in participation in the fifth year at school. Back in the 1970s, just 40% were staying on, but that had over doubled by 2013, the end of my data series here. The steepest increase was up to 1992, and this was the period over which the comprehensive reforms took place, but also strongly influenced by the collapsing youth labour market during that period. Now, the trend lines at the lower end of the chart, the increasing proportion staying on to sixth year. And of course, this again is associated with increasing entry to higher education. But now turning to the massive increase in attainment over this period as well. If you look at the downward sloping lines, sloping down from left to right, this is the decreasing proportion of youngsters leaving school with no qualifications at O grade, standard grade, or their equivalent. 70% of pupils left with nothing back in 1965, but it was just 4% in 2013. And the upward sloping trend lines show the increasing proportion achieving at least some hires. But you'll notice too the gap between the red and the blue lines, which is pointing out that the gender gap in favour of females followed on from the comprehensive reforms, because before then the selective system discriminated against girls in the selection process. But now let's look at equality of outcome. And here I'm going to focus on research using the Scottish School Leavers surveys, and I'm going to focus particularly on social class. As I say, the book covers a whole lot more issues. Now, the surveys were nationally representative surveys of young people following their transitions from school to further and higher education, training, the labour market, and so on. But the great strength was that we were able to use them to analyse inequalities by social class, gender, school characteristics, and to trace the effect of policy reforms. So I'm going to just talk about 3 studies, the early ending of selection, the early results of ending selection, of introducing standard grade, and then looking at trends, subsequent trends over time. And a really groundbreaking study by Andrew McPherson and Doug Wills used surveys from the 1970s, 60s and 70s, and it found that ending selection greatly reduced segregation, which, as Danny has pointed out from that quote from the Secretary of State, was one of the intrinsic difficulties about selective schooling. And not only that, but the comprehensive system has maintained this relatively low level of social segregation between schools subsequently, so that recent research using PISA shows that in Scotland, the social segregation between schools is amongst the lowest in the world. But also they found that ending selection increased attainment generally, but it reduced inequality because the most rapid increase in attainment was among working class pupils and amongst girls. So they were able to conclude that comprehensive schooling is better and fairer. And similarly, research by CES associate Adam Gameron looked at the early effects of the standard grade reforms and found that they did succeed in including the most disadvantaged students in academic courses. They led to a fast increase in attainment amongst the most disadvantaged pupils, but nevertheless the most advantaged still maintained their advantage. And this is illustrated by this chart, which is looking at the probability of obtaining an O grade or standard grade in mathematics. Back in 1984, when schools were still offering O grade courses, the disadvantaged student, that's shown by the orange bar in this chart, had just a 20% chance of getting an O grade in mathematics. But 1990, after the introduction of standard grade, that had increased to 68%. Now you can see from this chart that inequality remained, but nevertheless it was reduced. And that's the theme of my subsequent trends. In this chart, my attainment measure is a score derived from the number and grades of O grade, standard grade or equivalent courses, passes. And it shows that for all social class groups there was an increase in attainment after 1984. The purple line at the top, that's the managerial and professional group. The bold red line is the working class group. And you can see that there is a fairly large gap between all of these groups. But nevertheless, the gap was reduced over time, and that's statistically significant. But when we turn to the post-compulsory stage, you can see the gap is much wider. And it widens over time. I'd point out to you the increasing attainment of working class pupils after 1999 That's the effect of the higher still reforms. But nevertheless, the advantage of the middle class group is greater. So just to summarise those findings for you, there is persistent inequality in attainment by social class. At age 18, the attainment gap has been reduced slightly. But the thing is that the gap at 18 to 19, the post-compulsory stage, does widen. And this is where there's the greatest positional advantage, because it means that higher social class groups are more likely to enter higher education, get the attainment to get into higher education. So inequalities are maintained because of the increased inequality at the post-compulsory stage. Now, a whole range of CES research has found that attainment at school is the main determinant of young people's future careers and life chances. But going on now to equality of value, it's much more difficult to measure, but we can get strong evidence from it just by what young people say about their experiences at school and their attitudes to school. And the comments made by young people on the back pages of the survey in 1977 were published in a CES book, Tell Them From Me. And they showed that young people were very, very conscious of differences in value, that those who were the non-certificate pupils did not feel valued. And as you can see from this quote by one young woman, the ones who didn't sit their O grades, the teachers never bothered to learn them anything. And the ones who were not in O grade classes never got to see anybody about a job for advice, so no wonder people stayed off as much. Well, the surveys in subsequent years included broadly comparable questions, and they showed that over time, up to 2005, an increasing proportion felt that schoolwork was worth doing, my teachers helped me to do my best, teachers helped give me confidence to make decisions, and so on. But most notable is the improvement in the attitudes of the lowest quartile of attainment, who are comparable to those non-certificate pupils in the Tell Them From Me book. It's not perfect. I wouldn't like to sort of say it's completely equal, but nevertheless, compared with 1977, lower attaining pupils do appear to have a greater sense of inclusion in the school community, and we would suggest that this is partly related to the provision of universal examination systems like standard grade. Now, you'll notice that all of my data ends in 2005, despite the fact that an awful lot has happened in Scottish education over the past 10 years, not least a curriculum for excellence. But we just don't have the data. The Scottish School Leavers Survey, as Rowena has said, was discontinued, and there's no other data sources that allow us to do this depth of analysis, this type of analysis of inequalities. And we do feel it is a very, very great problem that we don't have a national survey that looks at young people's experiences of school and their perceptions of their school experience and the inequalities in their school experience. However, let me conclude by saying we do believe that comprehensive education has had some success in promoting equality, but it's had this greater success in terms of equality of opportunity and of value, but less success in terms of equality of outcomes. And we must point out that schools operate within a very unequal society. Comprehensive schools do their best to mitigate some of these effects, but nevertheless, I mean, we would point out that the comprehensive reforms can be characterised really as just open door policies. They merely remove institutional barriers. They do not provide targeted support for disadvantaged students that would create that special escalator to help them out of disadvantage. But also, schools themselves have a selective function. They do have to select pupils for different career pathways, some of which have greater, higher status than others. And so we would conclude that the conflicting expectations that society has of its schools does sometimes work in conflict with the principle of equality. But now I'll hand over to Kathy, who's going to take this forward.
Good morning. That was, I think, a masterly account by Linda of some of the data and trends in comprehensive education over the past 50 years. I want to do something a wee bit different. What I want to consider today is how comprehensive schooling in Scotland over the past 50 years has responded to the challenge that faces all education systems. That is how to accommodate the full range of young people with all their varied interests and abilities, and to do so in a way that enables them to flourish. At what stage should issues of differentiation, selection and choice come into play, and to what extent? And how should a system balance, get the right balance between uniformity and diversity? Now, arguably, these challenges are particularly acute for a comprehensive system because, as Danny has said, its principles, particularly those of liberty and equality, are in constant tension with each other. Now, I think one can characterise the first 3 decades or so of comprehensive schooling as being about the common school approach, which Linda has already referred to. So the idea of including all pupils in the same school with access to common curriculum and certification arrangements. And as Linda has already pointed out, this was really exemplified in the development of the standard grade, which, rather than pursuing different provision for different groups or types of young people, it sought to develop, and most would agree quite successfully sought to develop, national assessment for virtually all pupils based on common curriculum guidelines. And that the differences by ability were dealt with not by different provision, but, as Linda has said, by different levels of study. And she has shown the extent to which standard grade extended opportunities for national certification to virtually all pupils and helped to narrow the attainment gap, although obviously it didn't overcome it. And towards the end of our presentation, we saw the extent to which that had an impact on young people's attitudes to school. Now, even at the post-compulsory stage, over the first 30-odd years of comprehensive schooling, we still really pursued a fairly common, unified approach. And I mean, I think that's particularly notable because it's at the upper school that questions of diversity and choice become more acute as the selective function of education comes into play. But generally here too, we've avoided very separate provision taken by different groups of young people. And Linda mentioned the action plan, which introduced national certificate modules, which were generally more vocational in focus. Nevertheless, these were widely taken up in schools by pupils of all abilities and for a variety of purposes. Vocational, but also generally more academic in that some pupils took modules as a stepping stone to hires. So it was kind of integrated into provision. And also I think it's quite illustrative of the Scottish tradition is that the national certificate modules, while they aim to develop skills, also aim to develop knowledge and understanding. In 1992, the Howey report on the upper secondary school in Scotland reported, and it had a twin track proposal. The idea was to have a baccalaureate, an academic track for some, a minority of young people, while the others would take a modular vocational track. Now, that was rejected fairly definitively, and part of the reason was it was seen as incompatible the twin-track approach was seen as incompatible with comprehensive principles. And Linda has referred to the Higher Still reform, which eventually took place after Howie. And that, again, catered for all pupils through its levels of study, and actually combined aspects of curriculum and assessment of the former SCE provision, that is the more academic provision, with the ScotVec modular provision. But I think it's also, one can date a change in attitude and views from perhaps the late 1990s onwards, where there was increasing criticism of the uniformity and standardisation of the Scottish system of comprehensive schooling. And this surfaced, for example, in the national debate in the early 2000s, where although there was strong support across the board for comprehensive schools, there was also criticism of its uniformity and calls for a more diverse and flexible system as a way to motivate and give better provision to a wider range of pupils. But critically, the move to greater diversity was represented politically as a reinterpretation of comprehensive schooling, not, as has happened in England, as a move away from it. And this is a quote from Jack McConnell, who was then First Minister, where he states that, "I am committed to that comprehensive ideal. The modern comprehensive is diverse, not uniform or standard. Modern comprehensive schools need variety, ambition, leadership, flexibility and pupil choice. In other words, they must be diverse." And it's that last point I want to pick up on in relation to curriculum for excellence. So uniformity and standardisation have become perceived as negative aspects of the Scottish system. But we suggest that when you look at the history of comprehensive schooling in Scotland, a lesson from it is that in fact there are significant benefits of relative uniformity that Linda has already referred to. For example, low social segregation across schools and a consistency of standards. These have been internationally recognised and endorsed. And I quote our late colleague David Rafe here in terms of additional benefits of a more uniform system. And I see Christina nodding at this because her recent research has very much endorsed this point, and that's something we may come back to later. A uniform system is more transparent, more easily navigated by learners, more open to democratic control. Above all, diverse systems can easily turn into hierarchical and unequal systems. So we have curriculum for excellence now. It's a model that prioritises school-based innovation and diversity. And responsiveness to local needs and diversity and offering choice, these are all laudable aims, and it's not that we're arguing against that. But what we are saying is that we need to be careful in terms of thinking it through, in thinking about what the consequences might be, and in systematically monitoring the impact on inequalities. The greater diversity has the potential to increase social stratification in schools and perhaps introduce new selection effects into the system. A more diverse system requires considerable skill and knowledge to be able to negotiate it and make the best choices. And pupils and their parents differ in their ability, resources and contacts to be able to do that. But the choices that young people make in school have far-reaching consequences in terms of their future education and career prospects. So I think here, this, I would suggest, exemplifies the point Danny made at the beginning, that it's a tension between liberty, the greater diversity, introduced under the banner of personalisation and choice, in thinking about what the consequences might be for equality if it introduces greater segregation across schools and inequality in terms of pupils' ability to navigate the system. Now, Linda's already referred to the lack of data that we currently have. And the problem at the moment is we lack data to be able to analyse the impact of curriculum for excellence and a more diverse system on inequalities. We simply do not know. We don't even have a national picture of the nature and extent of diversity across all the schools in Scotland. And we certainly don't have the data to enable analysis of the impact of inequalities on participation, on attainment, or on the social segregation of schools. The recent OECD review of Curriculum for Excellence commissioned by the government is, very, very welcome, and hopefully it will provide useful insights. But it will not provide this more systematic review in terms of impact on equalities. And what we need is independent, system-wide research that enables a longitudinal analysis of the impact on equalities. The other thing that we suggest that is required is the development of commonly understood and shared principles for diversity. Curriculum for Excellence aims to provide diversity within a coherent framework. But what is meant by that has not been clearly articulated and spelt out. We need to develop such principles. How much diversity is desirable? And what is the balance between responsiveness to local needs and the level of coherence and consistency needed across the system as a whole? And schools, cannot be expected to be able to assess what the impact of their individual decisions are on the system as a whole. Now, turning to something slightly more practical in terms of ways of managing diversity, hopefully we've got the principles sorted out. One idea would be to develop a graduation certificate as a practical way to try and structure and manage the diversity. The team varies in its ideas on the detail of such a certificate, but the basic principles we share, the idea that all young people would follow a programme of study, which could be offered at different levels in relation to the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. There would be rules to guarantee breadth of study. It would include all types of qualifications, academic and vocational. And I think very importantly, it would provide recognition for the range of experiences and activities that young people undertake, whether through work experience, their own part-time work, volunteering, creative, sporting activities, and so on. These are the sorts of activities that really don't have credit sufficiently in the system at the moment. But I think critically, it would provide some structure and that would be particularly useful for the less advantaged pupils, the low attaining pupils, to work their way through a more diverse system. These are the pupils whose options are less well defined. If you're taking 4 or 5 hires, your options are fairly clear cut, your route is ahead of you. But if you're not in that position, your opportunities are more diverse and less obvious. And it's often these pupils whose families lack the kind of information, the knowledge, the contacts and the networks to make these important choices that have long-lasting impacts. Now, we're quite clear that introducing such a certificate will not be easy. It faces various challenges in terms of credibility and having currency as a full award in its own right, rather than selectors focusing on specific elements of it. But that is something that would be amenable to government influence, using existing policy levers to increase its status. And it would also be absolutely vital to design it in such a way that it was inclusive and it didn't form another hurdle for young people to try and jump and fail at. Finally, I'll end on our idea that, our suggestion that in fact comprehensive reform is incomplete in Scotland. That what we have is a comprehensive schooling system, not a comprehensive education system. Basically, 16 to 18-year-olds who are not in school are not included at the moment. And I think the time is ripe to really consider how we can extend the comprehensive principle, particularly at this post-compulsory stage. On the one hand, we have the senior phase of Curriculum for Excellence, which, although it's often overlooked, includes young people in school and out of school. But it's the in school that has the attention so far, and the out of school elements are overlooked. On the other hand, we have the initiative developing the young workforce, and most of the attention given to that tends to focus on the out of school elements. But that also covers young people in school. So perhaps these two initiatives provide the basis to begin to think about a more comprehensive education system. And here a graduation certificate could help by providing a mechanism by which to include the achievements of young people, whether they're in school, further education, work-based training, volunteering, or whatever. And to say that there are challenges in developing a comprehensive education system is probably an understatement. I could spend the rest of the morning listing them, but they include things like, really, we need to clarify and develop our thinking about academic and vocational learning. There's major issues of trust between sectors, FE not valuing maybe awards gained in school, higher education or employers looking at what FE does with some scrutiny. But I mean, a major aspect is the divided governance of school and post-school provision. Divided governance in terms of government responsibility, funding arrangements, and so on. And I know Danny is going to be saying more about that in his next presentation.
Thanks very much, Cathy and Linda. I think you'll agree with me, some really clear and coherent arguments in those 40 minutes worth of distilled magic. And I just want at this stage also to point out some other bits of distilled magic in the book. Although the publishers insisted that we keep the title Scotland, or Scottish rather, in the title of the book, we have 3 chapters commissioned from experts from Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, from England rather, from explaining in 4,000 words of distilled excellence, I would say, for anyone that doesn't know how these systems work, how these systems have responded to the challenges of their heritage and their particular circumstances, but still trying to match up to these challenges of diversity and uniformity, freedom and equality, the growth of fraternal feeling within the communities and so on. So I thoroughly recommend these 3 chapters, although the title of the book is about Scotland. And in fact, Tony Gallagher from Northern Ireland is with us this morning and will be concluding the morning for us. Well, you've had a clear, coherent, sustained argument from my 2 colleagues here. And I do attempt to do clear, coherent and sustained arguments from time to time, although my wife wouldn't necessarily agree with that. But what you're going to get from me at the end is a more emotional kind of rant. In 20 minutes I'm not able to go over all the ground I want to go over, so I'm just picking a few things which, as a school head teacher of 20 years experience, I saw all the time on the ground happening, and I wish that somehow we could translate that into policy. And that's the kind of bottom-up feel of the messiness of the system, the tensions in the system that don't quite work. And because we don't articulate these clearly enough in our policy discussions, we end up repeating these unnecessary tensions a great deal of the time. So I'm going to start with this one because it's of course the big one at the moment in political terms. And I'm going to start by asking that question, never mind the outputs, what about the unequal inputs? And a thing that we completely ignore in these discussions about closing the gap is that it's not only schools who are trying to close the gap, but in fact many people in society, including parents, are trying to keep that gap there. A recent study in England by Abigail McKnight for the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission coined the phrase glass floor to describe the way in which middle-class, advantaged, socially knowledgeable and socially networked parents provide a safety net under their children. Now, of course, that can start at the very beginning. The Sure Start initiative evaluations show the importance of the home learning environment. Growing Up in Scotland shows how early the gap begins. But it goes all the way through. We find young people being paid for by their parents to do unpaid internships. They're paid to have gap years to widen their experience. In one of the schools I worked in a socially advantaged area of Scotland during my career, I did a survey of who in the higher English classes was receiving private tutoring. 70% of those children were receiving private tutoring because their parents know that the difference between an A and a B is a big difference. And that doesn't appear on the radar at all anywhere. And I also know, and some of you may also know, parents in their 50s and 60s who are helping their children with their master's dissertation write-ups. So it goes all the way through, and there's an entirely unacknowledged part of how parents contribute. Parents with advantages will continue to seek to advantage or support their children. And why should they not? We live in a democracy, and that's their freedom and their right. But of course it does disadvantage those that don't have those skills, that knowledge, that financial capital with which to support the development of their children. And as was mentioned by Linda, one of the things we've seen over the years as more and more people have gained credits, we see a system of credit inflation, whereby all the way through to postgraduate stage and entering employment, the advantages of those with social advantages continue to play a significant role. And we had recently in Scotland the Child Poverty Action Group Scotland report, if you haven't seen that, about the cost of the school day, showing how very clearly in very specific terms how children from poor backgrounds suffer disadvantage from the beginning. And that's not disadvantage in the schools, that's disadvantage in our unequal society. Now, of course, none of this is about individuals. I think I want to make a very strong point that in all the schools I've worked in and almost all the people I've worked with in the Scottish comprehensive system, there's been a tremendous commitment to support individuals and to get them to the best level they can and find the right pathway for them and all the rest of it. The statistics are pretty clear. And while we may all have met and worked with individuals who have bucked the trends, and that is the case with all measurements in sociology, of course, the generalisations can't be ignored. So I argue, particularly just now, that we need... turn my page too quickly. This has been an equalising thing, actually. This has come in recently, the emphasis on exam attainment as the kind of proxy measure of everything in secondary education has shifted a little bit with the Wood report. Positive destinations was already there as a statistic for schools, but there's a renewed emphasis on this. It doesn't matter what destination, the basic message, it doesn't matter what destination you go to, as long as it's a positive destination and it's sustained. So the statistics then are much more equally valued, if you like. But of course, it's not true that every destination is equally valued by society. But in terms of the accountability of schools, that's been perhaps a quite positive measure. I mean, I've been in schools recently where they're using that to really energise the focus on children that are not doing hires and not doing external exams, and work with partners outside of school to make sure that every individual youngster goes on to something positive. But in a way that's almost despite our system, rather than because of it, and I'll come back to that in a wee bit, because we don't have a coherent curriculum design for 15 to 18, and we don't have coherent governance of 15 to 18. And in fact, because of the competitive selective aspect of 15 to 18, we've got this open-ended curriculum for excellence, 3 to 15, that's all about educational principles and supporting every learner and blah, blah, blah. And it's like a car crash when it meets the examination system, because we haven't properly worked through. It was said to be 3 to 18 curriculum, but it never was a 3 to 18 curriculum. So we do need to kind of revisit that, I think. And part of that is to do with the governance. We've got so many providers, as Kathy said. We've got a very complex map, therefore, of who's providing, and therefore who's responsible, and therefore who's accountable. And that doesn't really work just now. It's a bit messy. We also argue some other things about governance. There's a chapter about governance in the book. And one of the things we argue is that the Scottish system has a tendency to be too top-down. There's occasional little moves back towards a more bottom-up recognition in education. Scotland, for example, in the 2013 strategy document, recognised the need for local, situationally based decision-making as an important element of the mix. But too often in the past, and maybe in the future, we've had too much of a top-down system. And the problem with a top-down system where all the power is at the top and there isn't sufficient dialogue is that where you have a poor policy that's not working, the usual answer at the top is that's because the people on the ground aren't implementing it properly. But maybe the answer is it's not a very good policy in the first place. And too often we don't have the right systems for having that dialogue, and it just ends up being a political barney between the teacher unions, the head teachers, and national government or local authorities, and it becomes a political issue rather than an educational issue. On the other hand, fudge, we argue, can be helpful. We do have a lot of disagreements about things, and occasionally you need to fudge the boundaries to get agreement and to help people move forward together. But in Scotland we fudge too much, and we need greater clarity as to what we're trying to do. So, I've gone the wrong way, haven't I? So we need a better curriculum design. And I think we need to ask this question that the Nuffield Review asked in England. What counts as an educated 18-year-old? Because not only have we not asked that question in Scotland since the Howey Report, when I say we, I mean in civic debate as an entire Scottish community, we haven't asked that question. But we don't know the answer from all the documents that we've got. We've got an awful lot of documents telling us what education should be, 15 to 18. As Kathy said, we've got a very clear understood pathway, and then we've got a complex web of other pathways that most school teachers don't understand. Most of the people in those pathways understand their own bits, but not the rest of the picture. And we don't know necessarily where the funding's coming from for different pathways. There's uncertain end destinations, and most of all, young people don't understand these pathways very well either. So we argue strongly in the book that a unifying framework of some kind for 15 to 18 curriculum is needed. It has to be one that wait a minute, that's the one. Yeah. Sorry, I did change my slides at the last minute. This is maybe showing up. It's one that has to recognise that we're dealing with tensions and that we're dealing with values that can be incompatible in some situations and need to be helped to work together, as we talked about at the beginning. But we also need to recognise that education is about more than a destination. Education is about the growth of the individual person. And we seem to have lost that from our national debates recently. It's all about figures and statistics and all the rest of it. And while these can be important proxy measures of success and quality, it's the development of the child into an adult citizen that matters most. And we captured a bit of that in Curriculum for Excellence for all the controversy around it, but we lose it completely again in the senior phase. So we talk about a graduation certificate. As Kathy said, we didn't thrash out our ideas in this. And the ideas I'm going to present to you now are in my earlier book, Schooling Scotland, rather than in the book and the ideas we're talking about today. But we see that as a key part of unifying framework. So my suggestion is that we have different categories. In a graduation certificate, it should measure academic progress, but it can measure many other things as well, and there's a set that we could put up as a starter for 10. As Cathy said, people might say, well, what's the currency of this certificate? You know, how are end users going to use it? I put it to you this morning that the most important end user of such a certificate is the young person, him or herself, and the sense of value they receive in graduating with such a certificate, and having our entire Scottish community saying, well done, we recognise who you are and we recognise what you bring to the table. We're not just trying to fit you into a set of boxes like this is your higher box, this is your not quite so higher box, this is your you had to leave school early and now you're having to find something else box. You know, we should be saying all young people are entitled to education to age 18. We've said that in England. We've not made any, you know, we fudge all these, you know, we've got this fudgy post-compulsory system where some leave school and some don't. So in the book, Schooling Scotland, I give some ideas of the kinds of things that could be in such a graduation certificate. By the way, some of you may remember this was a recommendation of the OECD report in 2007 about Scottish education, which was not implemented by the government, although they took on board some of the other issues. And it is a graduation certificate, we reckon, at age 18, is a way in which we could try to pull together in a way that the civic community could understand, that pupils could understand, and parents could understand what Scotland thinks an educated 18-year-old should be able to do and be able to contribute, and what they should know. So we're in this situation in Scotland where we have a framework for improvement, and 15 to 18 has been punted into stage 2. Stage 1, of course, is not without its controversies with national testing, blah, blah, blah. But stage 2 is 15 to 18, and we're not going to see the outcome of that till 2017. So what a perfect opportunity for us to engage in the kind of debate that we are calling for with this book. The 50 years is a great opportunity for us to say, right, we've had our first 50 years, we've seen all the challenges, we've learned from them, and where do we want to go next? And as Cathy said, one of the key things we did agree on as editors of this book is that we need to reconfigure our thinking about Scottish comprehensive schooling to a wider vision of Scottish comprehensive education for all youngsters up to age 18. And that could be taking place in different places, with different providers, but it needs to be brought together in some kind of unifying framework, under some kind of coherent, clear vision. And it has to be a vision that retains the benefits of uniformity, which brings greater equality, the need for diversity, which is fundamental to our individuality and our individual lives in a democracy, while importantly, as comprehensive schools have done very much for the Scottish community, retaining the benefits of fraternity, where people have quality of face-to-face relationships based across the social spectrum, meeting people from this very plural and diverse and great society we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. It's very concise, lots of challenges, food for thought. Danny, when you were talking about glass floors, last week when I was working with groups of young people, migrant young people, they talked about concrete ceilings. So we have time now for questions, comments, and I would like to also remind you have an opportunity to field questions in the sheet that you have, so please jot down things if you don't get a chance now to say something. The panel are waiting for your questions later. So, can I open up to the floor? If you're asking a question and making a comment, it would be very helpful if you could say who you are, so that would help us. Anyone at all? Please, thank you. Right at the end, Elizabeth.
Well, hello, I'm Hugh Miller.
Oh, right, Hugh. And then, Danny to that again. Hugh, thank you.
Sorry about that. From here, and I was wondering as I listened, particularly at the beginning, what the importance would be 50 years ago of the strong political leadership that was available both in the Scottish office and in the local authorities. And such a big change is difficult to deliver without the proper support in the highest of places. Do you not think?
So a question about the need for leadership, and I would like you to also maybe, as you reflect upon answering, consider that in the current time of austerity, so the pragmatics of now, in fact, would be quite useful to hear. Who would like to start? Kathy?
Yes, I mean, is this mic alive? Yep. Yeah, I mean, that relates to the point that I was making about the need for a national overview and the fact that, I mean, I think it's a real issue about the extent to which we balance the school-based, the local innovation with trying to get a coherent national system. I mean, it's arguable that standard grade reform could not have happened without a strong national and local authority, particularly local authority input. And I know from a range of research I've done over the years I seem to have, I haven't had quite the length of career that Danny has, but I seem to have researched most of the key reforms in Scotland, that the local authority input has been vital. For example, I can remember with the introduction of Higher Still, the role that the local authority advisors played and the local authority groupings of different subject areas. So, yes, I do think that there's a real question about, again, how you balance, get the best of the local school-based innovation and do not stifle the bottom-up, but how you get the necessary overview and impetus nationally.
I can just add a few things looking back to 65. I think that was a classic example of both leadership and fudge. The leadership had a very, very clear idea, which was to abolish selection. And that was very, very clear and focused all the political debate and the sense of urgency and the sense of the need for a national change. But on the other hand, there was a lot of fudge around what would happen afterwards and how these schools would work. And I think a lot of people in the system believed that really what should happen is really just that the better schools, the senior secondary schools, should take over the junior secondary schools. And effectively in many areas, that's what happened in curricular terms and in terms of seniority of staff. For very often it was the senior secondary head teacher who became the head teacher of the new comprehensive. So I think there was a lot of fudging about went on as well, but there was also a huge amount of bottom-up commitments. Kathy's said, I know from your own career, Hugh, and certainly from my career, when we entered as young teachers these comprehensive schools, we had a fantastic energy and vision about what we thought we were there to do. And I think the leadership of teachers is really, really important and often underrated. It's not political leadership, but professional leadership, based on a clear set of values about where we should be going.
Okay, I just want, Hugh, if you don't mind, any particular point that you would like to respond back in that? Because I know you've got a lot of experience in this area.
Sure. The thought crossed my mind as I saw the statement from the Scottish office that was in an early slide, that Bill Ross was the Secretary of State, Bruce Millen was the Undersecretary, and that in the local authorities, the mining communities were very strongly represented, and these folk had an experience and a determination to put an end to injustice, and were able to deliver that. So if we want to do something encouraging going forward, and I'd very much like the idea of accrediting voluntary service and getting something that people can get out of the school to do, and give them credit for that. If we want to do something different going forward, then the more support we can get from our politicians, the more likely we are to succeed.
Thank you. And one final question, because the Minister has arrived, so I'd like to actually...
No, that's okay. I'm happy to leave my question till later.
That's fine. Thank you very much for that courtesy. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like you to join me again in thanking my three colleagues for an excellent presentation this morning. So I have the pleasure now, and perfect timing, Dr. Alistair Allen, who is the Minister for Learning, Science and Scotland's Languages. And I know that you're passionate, definitely, about languages. This is the one area that we have worked a little bit, and I know more of your work. But I also know that you actually have at your heart not just high-quality education, but social justice within education. So on that basis, I am delighted you're able to join us, and I would like to invite you to take the floor. There is a lapel mic, Minister, so if you...
Can you hear me without it?
I think they're live streaming.
Oh, you're live streaming?
Yes.
Okay.
We have people from parts of the UK wanting to listen in. That's great, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll ask again if people can hear me.
Yes.
In that case, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much, Dr. Arshad, for the warm welcome and the invitation to join you. I hope that today allows you all the opportunity to discuss everyone's future lessons from 50 years of Scottish comprehensive schooling, which I believe was successfully launched back in June as a publication. I first took up post as Minister in the Scottish Government in May 2011, and since then I've been in the privileged position of helping to shape, I hope, the future of Scotland's education system, a responsibility I certainly take very seriously and I'm honoured to have. Now, as you all know, it was Scotland that pioneered the idea of universal access to school education, or to primary education at least, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And ever since then, our country's identity has been, to a large extent, characterised by a clear and sustained commitment to that principle. It's a system that has certainly offered me, and I'm sure you, and so many others, a very great deal. So, if you'll permit me, I think it's worth taking a moment to remember what the Scottish system of comprehensive secondary education replaced. Like many, if not most people of their generation, my parents and their siblings were the first in their families to attend secondary school. My grandparents actually passed their QALY, as it was called, their QALY exams aged 11, but were told by their own parents that they should stay on at the village school until they were 14 and then seek work. Now, all that, I concede, was a long time ago, but it kind of demonstrates the point that I think is being made today. And that is, I believe, that the comprehensive system of schooling in Scotland has, I believe, proved to be far and away the best guarantee not only of social cohesion, but of social mobility too. So there is a great deal for us to cherish about our system and about its role in shaping our lives and our society. But at the same time, recognition of those past achievements, as significant as they are, must not be used as justification for standing still. Now, this was clearly a view that was shared by those who had the foresight to pursue the introduction of a comprehensive education back in 1965, a radical change at the time. Scottish Education Department Circular 600, which I'm sure you're familiar with, sets out what was required, stating that the most desirable form of organisation will be the secondary school providing a full range of courses for all pupils from a particular district who would attend it throughout their secondary education. Now, 50 years have since passed, but the ideas underlying this statement ring as true today as they did then. A commitment to supporting each and every child to reach their full potential, no matter their background, and an educational offer which matches and has the capacity to deliver that aspiration. Equality of access and opportunity for all are the hallmarks of comprehensive education. They are also, perhaps then unsurprisingly, key to the success of our education system here in Scotland. A system that has seen our young people gain a record number of passes at higher and advanced higher, and more awards, national certificates and qualifications relating to wider skills than ever before. A system that now supports a higher proportion of our population to progress into further and higher education than any other European country, and a system that has resulted in a record number of our young people leaving school for positive destinations. Nobody would argue against the notion that a strong education system is essential if we are to prosper as a modern, forward-looking nation. The kind of jobs that are available both locally and globally have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, and the skills and knowledge required to carry out those jobs have changed too. At the recent Scottish Learning Festival, I launched the formal consultation on a digital learning and teaching strategy. Who could have imagined the impact of the digital age 50 years ago and the importance of digital technology in supporting positive educational outcomes for all? It's absolutely crucial that the education system is able to respond to these new opportunities. Thankfully, the evidence is there to say that it can. And looking back from the raising of the school leaving age to 16 in 1972 and the abolition of corporal punishment in 1986, our system has evolved very significantly, embracing the needs and values of our communities along the way. And continuing that theme, it is now 13 years since the national debate on education, the debate which led to the introduction of Curriculum for Excellence. Today's event provides an opportunity to pause and reflect on the progress we have made in that time. The monumental effort, and I want to acknowledge this, the monumental effort of teachers, parents and learners across the country to introduce the new curriculum and the new qualifications is already bearing fruit, energising learning and teaching in Scotland, making it more relevant to the modern world, and giving young people the skills, knowledge and understanding that they need to succeed in learning, life and work. I'm encouraged by the range of partnership working that is developing with more schools, better working together and increasingly working with colleges, employers and the third sector organisations. I'm encouraged by the evolution in the curriculum offer from a number of secondary schools as they continue to move away from traditional curriculum patterns to a much more broadly based educational experience, valuing skills and attributes as well as knowledge, whilst offering opportunities for personalisation and choice. Skills development is crucial for all our young people, as is the opportunity to experience motivational, work-related learning as part of their curriculum. It's vital that we do not close off a young person's options too early, a clear failing, I believe, of other approaches. Instead, we need to widen the range of pathways and options available to all young people, and a comprehensive model of education provides a solid platform for the breadth of learning we must encourage. Perhaps as a demonstration of this, I want to touch on the important role of developing the young workforce in supporting our ambitious target to reduce youth unemployment by 40% by 2021. The implementation of DYW supports the aims of Curriculum for Excellence to support outcomes for all young people. Schools and their partners now have far greater flexibility to offer a range of pathways which better meet the needs and raise the attainment levels of all their learners including those who have been the least engaged. Now, in comparison with 50 years ago, the education of our young people is now a shared endeavour. Partnership working has been a game changer in itself, and under DYW, schools, colleges, parents, employers, and a wide range of partners all have an important role in driving this agenda forward. And importantly, the voice of children and young people is now louder than ever before, and crucially, I hope, listened to much more carefully and closely. Over the last year, the Scottish Government has held a series of children's summits to give our young people an opportunity to express their views and influence the decisions which affect them. The feedback from these events is also now helping to shape the Year of Young People in 2018. Our young people are also placed at the centre of decisions locally, encouraged and empowered through Curriculum for Excellence to lead their own learning. And a new Children and Young People's Health and Wellbeing Survey is being planned from 2017. Now, looking ahead more broadly, it is my firm view that the type of inclusive, holistic and comprehensive approach to education we have adopted in Scotland is the right one. It leaves us well placed to foster the equality of opportunity and, more importantly, equality of outcome that we want to see. However, there is still work to do before we get to that point. And that is why, rightly, the First Minister has put tackling inequality at the heart of this government's agenda. And within education, it is why she and I and other ministers are determined to close the attainment gap between children from the least and most deprived areas. That gap, as you appreciate, is still significant and unacceptable within and between schools and indeed classes and children in different parts of Scotland. In 2014, almost 4 in 10 students from the most deprived areas of Scotland obtained at least one higher or equivalent. For students from the most affluent areas, it was 8 out of 10. In other words, when it comes to hires, only half of school leavers from the most deprived 20% of areas in Scotland do as well as those from our most affluent areas. There is evidence to suggest that the gap is narrowing, but a lot more clearly still has to be done. And that's why we have placed education at the heart of our programme for government, particularly our plans for the National Improvement Framework. The framework focuses on what we need to do to help close the gap in attainment and to ensure all children can succeed. That's what we mean when we talk about equality of outcome and also about equity of outcome. Not that all children achieve the same qualifications, but that each and every child in every community has every chance to succeed at school and in life. In a modern Scotland, the community in which a child lives simply cannot be a factor or be allowed to be a factor in their ability to aspire and achieve. And that is why we have launched the Scottish Attainment Challenge. And to support this work, I am very pleased to announce the appointment of Professor Chris Chapman, who will take up the role of Senior Academic Advisor to support the development and implementation of the Scottish Attainment Challenge. We will be drawing on Professor Chapman's significant expertise in the field of educational change to ensure that the improvement journeys our schools embark on are supported by the most robust research, evidence and professional advice on what works. The challenge is backed by the Attainment Scotland Fund with £100 million of targeted support for our most deprived communities. However, the real prize from the fund will be the learning we gain from individual schools and authorities about what works. Learning can and will be shared across Scotland as part of the universal support we are putting in place to raise attainment. And of course, none of this would be possible without our highly skilled professional workforce. The need to ensure high quality teaching and leadership is a consistent thread that runs through many of the Scottish Government's policies and indeed through the last 50 years of Scottish education. We're here to recognise the passing of 50 years since the introduction of comprehensive education. But this year marks another important milestone, the 50th anniversary of the founding of the General Teaching Council for Scotland, a body which has done much to maintain and improve the standards of the teaching profession in our country. As a government, we are committed, and as committed as ever, to strengthening the standard of teaching in our schools. Through our ongoing commitment to maintaining teacher numbers, supplemented by the work from Teaching Scotland's Future and the foundation of the Scottish College for Educational Leadership, we are taking positive steps which we believe will support our workforce in the years that lie ahead. After all, our commitment must not only be to improve the quality of the education being provided for our children of today, but also for our young people of the future. No child should be born to fail. And we owe it to future generations to build on the principles of fairness and equality of opportunity that are so central to Scotland's comprehensive education system, to rise to the persistent challenge of inequality, and to deliver an education system that gives every child in Scotland every chance to realise their dreams, no matter who they are and no matter where they go to school. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very, very much. I think you managed in 15 minutes actually to, for me, do two things. One is to remind us how in Scotland we constantly punch above our weight, and we have lots of good ideas and good policies to take forward. And I think this morning has reflected on 50 years of what we've learned, but what you've done is given us the next, I hope, not so 50 years, but certainly the next few years. But the other lesson, the message that was coming up is perhaps we are beginning to join up the dots. And, you know, the fact that you're talking about schools alongside communities, alongside industry, alongside third sector, alongside parents, that is music. That, in a way, is the beginning of the journey to comprehensive education. And I think that that is something, we made a distinction this morning, Minister, between comprehensive schooling, which we think we've done, but we now need comprehensive education.
I will remember that distinction in future.
Okay, well, I think then all I can say is thank you, because I know you have a busy schedule and you'll need to go back. So can I thank you and let you be away?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. No, you can't quite go yet. You can. I have to remind you, question box is outside. Please put your questions in there before you go to coffee, or hand it in to one of the speakers. And please, can you come back on time at 11:30? So I think that's the two things, and there's a bookstore in the drama room. So we'll see you back here at 11:30. Thank you.
Very well, thank you. Great. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
have to.
And also lots of questions, so thank you to those of you who've submitted questions so far. I'm going to introduce the panel in just really their titles. It's on your programme, but so that you know who they are. Avril McNeil on my far left, your right, head teacher Glenrothes High. Walter Humes, visiting professor, Stirling University. Larry Flanagan, General Secretary of the Educational Institute of Scotland. And Linda McTavish to my far right, Chair of the Board of Lanarkshire College of Further Education. I'm sure they will draw from their experience and you will learn more about each of them as they answer your questions. The way I'm going to run this session is there are questions. I'm going to call the people who have actually put forward the questions, and then if you could read them out, I mean, you'll know the format. Now, to the panel members, because we want to get through the questions, there's quite a few, do not feel obligated to have to answer every single question, but obviously we want to make sure that all your voices are heard over the course of the time. There is a live Twitter feed going on in the back, so there's an opportunity for some of you here, I know you've been tweeting, but also it's an opportunity for our colleagues who are watching live stream to actually tweet in as well. So that's useful. Okay, so my very first question then goes to Gillian McCluskey. Where are Gillian, please?
Just first of all, thank you very much for the really thought-provoking things we've been listening to this morning. My question is about the link that Alistair Allen made himself, speaking to us just before the break, about the links between curriculum for excellence and comprehensive schooling. So, curriculum for excellence talks about diversity, choice, thinking about local innovations, local level. How can we ensure that does not mean that we are talking about increasing inequality?
Thank you, Gillian. Avril, I'm actually going to come to you, if we don't mind, to start off, as somebody who has to actually take curriculum for excellence forward in practice in the school.
I think it's a very, very useful question, and one that's very much in the minds of all educators across Scotland at this time. In terms of the local context, I think a number of things have been thrown up this morning, including the need to really inspire your community and the work that's been done within our schools, both by our teachers, in terms of the work that's going on every day in our classrooms, the amount of the delivery of the new qualifications through CFE, and obviously we will be at the end of that with the implementation of advanced higher this session. It has obviously been compounded year on year, and we're very grateful to our teachers in the classroom and at the chalk face for everything that they're doing. In terms of also in the local context, one of the points that was also raised about what else are teachers doing within the classroom, and I think the amount of their own time that has actually been given, and that I think that we have to, and certainly for me as a head teacher, I want to really thank our professionals in terms of what they are doing out with the classroom for young people on a daily basis, both in terms of the voluntary work, in terms of study support, which goes on in classrooms daily, at lunchtimes, after school, things like Easter schemes where people are giving up time within their holidays. But it's how does that then, I think your question is, in terms of local innovation, bringing the community into the school is hugely important. We heard from the Minister also about developing Scotland's young workforce, about bringing businesses in, about trying to get that whole community context within your school. That is pivotal. And it's a good question. How do we do it? We have to ensure that we are doing that we're bringing stakeholders, businesses, partners, parents into the school mix. But how do we, your question is, how do we ensure then that we're not increasing inequality? I think, for me, certainly, one of the positives has been the use of insight in terms of the move away from stacks, where when we did measure stacks, we were looking at attainment in the same group of young people maybe 7, 8 or 9 times, and they were counted in schools' results. The move towards, I suppose, looking across the piece in terms of socioeconomic deciles, the CIMID data, is actually helping schools to ensure that we are addressing those inequalities in terms of our local context, the national context, but also in terms of socioeconomic data, and that we're actually doing something with that data rather than it just being a kind of a fudge, or I think as someone said, a tablet of information.
Larry.
Well, I suppose my initial response would be to ask you to define inequality, because I think at the moment, in terms of our secondary experience, we are still too fixated on qualifications. And inequality might then be defined as one child gets 5 national fives, another gets 5 hires, therefore there's an equal outcome. But in actual fact, those 5 national fives might be actually a very high level of accomplishment for that pupil. And I think the real challenge, and it's been touched on this morning, around Curriculum for Excellence, the bigger ambitions of that programme, and particularly around the senior phase, is that we have not moved our thinking away from benchmarking progress in our schools against qualifications. And the senior phase is a classic example. All we have done with the senior phase at the moment is replace a reasonably well understood qualification system of standard grade and the national qualifications with a less well understood system of nationals, most of which have been, or most of the focus around which has been on the hires. How many hires will this new system deliver for my child? The whole agenda around the senior phase was supposed to be predicated on those young people who were actually not achieving at school at all. And the biggest change that should have happened was not for your 5 higher candidates, but for the kids who were leaving schools with access qualifications or intermediate ones, and then possibly not going on to a positive destination. And we haven't even touched that. We haven't even touched that because we've spent 3 years obsessing about delivering the higher and delivering national 5. And one of the dangers, I think, at the moment is that because we have the Wood Report and Developing Scotland's Young Workforce, that we're almost about to just cede all of that senior phase stuff over to the Woods Commission. And somehow that will pick up all those ambitions. Now, I remember having a meeting with Sir Ian Wood in the early stages of him developing his report, and he was talking about a range of things. And I was sitting there saying to him, we're doing all this. This is what the senior phase is about. The senior phase, this is the ambition of the senior phase, to actually make these connections with college and industry. And he did take it on board. He kind of built it into his recommendations. But in terms of schools, and there's some really good practice in schools around college links and looking at a range of vocational qualifications. But as a system, we are still too focused on qualifications. And we are not going to, until we move away from that, we are not going to be able to define what is a genuine equality in terms of the experience of young people. And it almost takes you back to the question that was asked, what do we actually expect an educated 18-year-old to be? At the moment, the system would say somebody with a lot of good qualifications. If you actually believe in what CFE was aiming at, you say somebody who actually can demonstrate the 4 capacities, one of which is a subset around qualifications, but most of which is actually about the character of the young person and their capability, their resilience in terms of moving out to the outside world.
Thank you. Walter, and then I'm going to come to you, Linda, because you, of course, with your experience in further education, have had to deal with issues of choice diversity as well as equality. So,
I'm going to be very brief in my response to this question. I cannot, however, promise that I will not bore you with some of my later answers. I think the question gets to the heart of the issues that were introduced in the opening session about the tensions between equality and liberty. And as the presenters suggested, there is no magical solution to that tension. There's always going to be a tendency for the two principles to pull against each other. What I would say, however, is that it's important to recognise that equality need not always mean sameness. Lionel Elvin wrote a book some years ago called, rather pretentiously called, The Place of Common Sense in Educational Thought. I think it's rather bold of a writer to claim to have a monopoly of common sense. And he suggested that what mattered was not always the sameness or identity of treatment, but that it was important to show equality of concern and equality of consideration to all pupils. And that sometimes might mean treating them differently. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you. Linda?
I'm going to take it from the perspective of colleges. Is that okay? And I suppose one of my disappointments is that we've not mentioned other qualifications that are available in schools, like HNCs and HNDs that go into the course system. Uniformity and diversity. We've had a major reform of our sector that has a regional basis for the colleges. And that regional basis is to recognise regional cultures, regional economies and regional situations. So the needs of a further education sector in the Western Isles may be different from the needs of a further education sector in parts of Lanarkshire. But both of them will still have a basis in similar qualifications. But there will be round the edge, around the centre, specific things relating to local schools and local communities. And that's a kind of big thing. The other thing in this, and the Minister spoke about it, is I need to hear the voice of the student also saying what they consider an 18-year-old should have in terms of intrinsic values. We gave them the vote at the biggest question that Scotland faced. We can give them the vote in this too. I think it is really, really important that we have, and there likely should be a student in this panel too, right? Because I think that is kind of roots in school. I understand the higher route. I came that route. My children came that route. You know, I've been involved as development officers in all these major programmes. I was a principal of a college before I've got this position as a chair. But I also know there are other routes to great success in life. And there's routes that encompass apprenticeships. And Wood kind of talks about the apprenticeship routes because there's certain industries that it's the apprenticeship route is the route to great success. And I think schools and colleges can work really, really well together in delivering that to success. So what are we saying? I think that we're looking for some diversity because that diversity will allow us greater equalities in the end.
Thank you very much to the panel. I think that Larry's point about asking the question about what's inequality, but actually within that, I keep getting the phrase, what are we valuing as well, and how do we value? So that's fundamental there. So thank you to Gillian for that question. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Santa Rosa, who is a research officer with North Ayrshire Council, Education and Youth Employment. So can I invite you to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much, and I appreciate the wide spread of backgrounds of people in the room. So I want to ask if the panel thinks that comprehensive schooling and competitive learning environment are incompatible to some extent. or not. I wouldn't know if you think that Scottish learners wouldn't benefit from raising ambition and aspiration through competing or comparing their own performance with others.
Thank you very much. So would Scottish learners benefit from adopting a more ambitious attitude in the classroom? Larry, maybe from your years of experience and now in your current role, maybe useful to hear your view.
Well, I'm not anti-competition. I mean, I think, big debate around sports, whether we should have competitive sports. I'm in favour of competitive sports. I think competition plays a role. But I would react slightly against its use in terms of what is the appropriate learning environment for our schools. I would much rather be looking at how we create a cooperative learning environment where young people are being challenged to work effectively with one another and to learn from one another. Now, in a classroom situation, as a teacher, you could use a competitive element around certain aspects of learning just because I think young people do enjoy competition, they enjoy that kind of element of it. But I wouldn't want to see a system where the hallmark was pupils measuring themselves against other pupils. I mean, it already happens, right? Pupils are enormously astute, right? So if you arrange ability groups in your class, you can call them red group, blue group, green group. Everybody knows what group they're in, so people understand that. So I think if you read the book, some of the criticisms of the failure of comprehensive schools to actually deliver comprehensive education has been around the fact that we still segregated pupils, which was largely on the kind of not quite a competitive basis, but on the basis of, you're suited for sitting these particular qualifications, you're set in this class because this is your level, and that that's a kind of echo of the competitive atmosphere. People trying to get into the credit class or get into the top higher class because they think that's going to benefit them. As a principal teacher of English, I remember going along to Ken Cunningham, who was my head teacher, and saying to him, I'm going to organise all the standard grade classes as mixed ability classes. Is that okay? And Ken said, that's okay. If it doesn't work, you're to blame. And that he was very good at delegating blame, Ken. But he basically said, just go on with it. And I had to persuade colleagues to do that, but that was based on the idea of pupils working collaboratively and cooperatively rather than, this kind of differentiation and then benchmarking against each other. So, I would be keen that competition did not become a key element of how we motivate pupils around their learning agendas.
Avril, again, very, very close to your heart, I'm sure, as a head teacher.
I would certainly echo many of the aspects of what Larry said there, that I think in the 21st century we are very much looking to ensure that we are aspirational for our young people and for our learners. Certainly that's a huge part of our vision, values and aims of our school, and as it will be in many of your schools too, that we're aspiring to excellence, but it's also about improving life chances for young people. And I would echo the point that yes, there needs to be an element of competition, whether that is in terms of sporting competition, whether it's in terms of what young people are doing for their community and out with, but I would also very much look towards in terms of Scottish learners that it's about creating the correct climate and the correct ethos and culture within a school so that young people are actually aspirational, that we are teaching them in terms of pedagogy the skills that they need to learn and the skills that they need for life, and obviously as we've mentioned previously in terms of further higher education but also ready for the workplace. So for me certainly it's about the ethos and culture that you create within your school, supporting your staff and being aspirational with and for the young people that you're delivering a service for, but also for your staff, for your community and for your partners within that. So really just to summarise, I would say that it does have its place in terms of, I would agree, a sporting element, but I too would echo the pedagogy of a more collaborative approach towards learning, and also things like collaborative inquiry, that if we're looking at developing pedagogy across schools, using that inquiry as stance or using that collaborative inquiry across the school is far more aspirational for our learners than necessarily looking purely at a competitive element.
I don't know if Walter, Linda, you have anything you want to add?
No, I would support that, because I also look in life, it is about people working in teams. Maybe about leadership, I would maybe talk about, is maybe an aspect rather than competition. But if we think about people working together, and I think it's in schools that people learn a lot of that, but also in the voluntary activities that they're in. So the two other speakers, I think, set the scene very well for us.
Thank you, Linda. Walter?
Can I take a slightly different line? My view is that whenever one interpretation of learning begins to become dominant, we should start to become suspicious. And there is a dominant view which is about collaboration and cooperation. There is a dominant psychological background to that, which is that learning should be socially interactionist. We should ask where that view has come from. That view came from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky, who was an apologist for the Soviet system. So you are dealing with a view that tends in the direction of conformity. I am not a pedagogical fundamentalist in that I don't think there is a single right view of learning. I want diversity of approaches to learning, and that means that sometimes there will be a place for competition. Not all the time, and it shouldn't be oppressive and dominant in a way that excludes lots of children, but there should be an element of competition, and I would cite in support of it the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci, who believed strongly in conservative schooling for radical politics. You have to leave open the way for criticism, diversity, and challenge.
Thank you very much. Now, on that note, I'd like to open up to see if any responses from, not necessarily to Walter, but actually from what you've heard as a topic, because you may have a different point of view, you may have something else you'd like to add. So I've got one hand up here, Sheila. And, oh yes, thank you. So can I start with Sheila, because your hand went up first. Is there a microphone for the front here, Grace? Thank you.
I was a little bit concerned that some of the comments from the panel seem to be dismissive of the idea that socioeconomic inequalities in educational outcomes are important. I think it's a real problem when we find private schools, for example, having such a disproportionate number of places in ancient universities in Scotland, and also people from professional managerial backgrounds, which means that in Scotland, law, medicine and professions continue to be dominated by the privileged middle classes. And so we absolutely can't say that we should stop looking at socioeconomic backgrounds. Indeed, the government has said it wants to eliminate such differences, which is possibly rather ambitious, but we should not be complacent about just saying let's let all children do what they feel comfortable with. We have to really determine, I think, to challenge these.
Rather than get a comeback from the panel at the moment, I actually have two questions looking at the issue of private education and whether how that sits is the elephant in the room question. So can I ask you to hold that, what Sheila said, and hold your thoughts on that? Because we'll come back to it after this particular question, which ties in, but it's looking more at how one uses competition within schools. But can I go to the back, please?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Brian Boyd from the University of Strathclyde. I wonder if I could just wrap a couple of issues around this one question. Just before the Minister spoke, I was going to ask a question about selection. I mean, I think we all realise that comprehensive education came as a result of a feeling that selection was no longer morally justifiable. But didn't we just replace it with internal selection? It seems to me that there's an elephant in the room about the issue of how comprehensives really are. And if you're in the bottom set for almost all of your subjects, I wonder what your self-esteem is there, and I think we've got to look at that. However, can I take up Walter's point about the dominance of pedagogical approaches? I agree with Walter. I think whenever anything becomes dominant, particularly if it's dominant for the wrong reason, then we need to start asking questions. I'm not sure, however, that I would dismiss Vygotsky simply because his views of the Soviet regime. If we're going to dismiss educational theories for their views, political views, there might not be too many left that we would support. So I think, the issue really, the question about competition is really, in a sense, not the right question. The question is about having diversity of pedagogical approaches and to make sure that there is some kind of, reconciliation between the aims and the values of the school and the way in which teaching and learning takes place. That's what Curriculum for Excellence was about, looking at not just what is taught, but how it's taught.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. So I think it was more of a comment and a response back rather than a question. So let's see if there's anybody else with a comment on this particular question. If there isn't, I think you're chomping at the bit to go to the next question, aren't you? So we'll ask you, because you asked that, any response from yourself as a final word?
I welcome all the comments, and I read my notes here because they're a valuable addition to the idea of comprehensive schooling as it was presented in the first part of today's event. But I would add just a bit of ending to the meaning of the competition that I asked a question about, is the fact that these kids are going out into a world where competitive employment is the rule. The labor market is competitive, and the first thing they're going to face is the difficulty of competing with others for place.
Which ties into Sheila's point.
Could I maybe come
Yes?
in?
Yeah.
I would go a wee bit further. You said that I would agree that the labour market to go in, university is competitive, but what I'm looking at in the workforce, is it the competitive bit that actually makes the successful business, or is it the team playing, etc.? You know, the work skills. So there's maybe two different aspects to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, so
entry and then, yes, and then we go in.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got two questions here, and I want both of the questioners to just ask their questions because there is a link, obviously. One is Anna Poulter. So where's Anna? Right. And the second one is from Ashley Poughton. So, right. So that's very handy. You're both sitting quite close. So would you like to ask your question?
Okay. My question is, what does the independent sector in schooling... What challenges does the independent sector in schooling pose for comprehensive schooling, and what to do about it? And a more broader question would be, how does the quite substantial independent sector in Edinburgh fit into the narrative of a particular Scottish tradition of comprehensive schooling?
Okay, thank you, Anna. Now we move on to Ashley.
Yes, echoing pretty much exactly the same sentiments. And I think it is, as you noted earlier, the elephant in the room, and amongst all the talk of Scotland's traditional equality and everything. I actually launched a petition to remove charitable status from private schools, which sits very uneasily, and I think that's the very least we need to do in tackling private education. So yeah, just the same point, and also to come back to the notion of the conflict between liberty and equality, and does in this case the parents' right to choose, so the liberty completely undermine any progress towards wider equality on a national level, and what should then take precedence. And yeah, the role of the private education establishment being at the heart of continued and profound gaps in attainment between the least and most privileged children. So regardless of what we do in the comprehensive education sector, as long as the private education sector is there cannot be equality of attainment.
Right, so can these choices sit comfortably together? And then what is the position of the Edinburgh situation? I'm sure the panel will have their various views on that. And then the tie into Sheila's question about actually there's the reality of then the next phase, how do you make it? So, and the fact that there are more people with from private education or from people from middle class and upper class backgrounds that get into universities like the University of Edinburgh. So who would like to start here? Walter.
I'm glad these questions have been put. I recently had the opportunity to speak at the University of St Andrews on the motion in the student debate that this House believes that private schools should be abolished, which I thought was quite a bold motion for the University of St Andrews, given the student composition there. And I was given the option of which side I would speak on. And I decided to speak for the motion because I thought it had more provocation value. And And it was really quite interesting because it was a very well-attended debate. Students were given an opportunity to speak after the main speakers. The person leading the other side, incidentally, was Professor Lindsay Patterson of this university. And I expected to be utterly demolished in the debate. I didn't win, but the vote was 69 in favour of the motion and 70 against, which I thought was really quite interesting. Clearly there was a significant proportion of the student body who wanted to dissociate themselves from the traditional image of the privileged Hooray Henry from the home counties. That by way of introduction, a little local colour. The Edinburgh situation, I think, needs to be raised. And it's interesting that no politician of any party seems prepared to engage with the issue of independent schools. The fact of the matter is that some 4% of youngsters in Scotland go to independent schools. In Edinburgh, that figure approaches 25%. There is a real social divide. The poet and novelist Kate Clanchy has compared the system to the Hindu caste system. In Edinburgh, the question, which school did you go to, is not an innocent request for information. It is designed to place you on the social pecking order. And, of course, one of the reasons, apart from the political lack of courage in addressing this question, is the fact that there are very powerful forces at work in preserving the system because of intergenerational advantage. And you see this particularly in the medical and legal professions. It's also supported by the financial services sector and the cultural elite in Edinburgh. Now, it requires, I'm not going to pretend that the private schools could be abolished overnight. And that's not going to happen, just as the House of Lords is not going to be abolished in the near future, however attractive that idea might seem. But what could be done is to put pressure on the independent sector to show more social responsibility by having more full scholarships, for instance, from able students to attend. Fettes College has 2% of its school population having full scholarships. And I think that only happened because of pressure in relation to the charitable status question. The charitable status position, the tax advantages of independent schools could be looked at, but I think it would be better if those schools showed a greater willingness to contribute to the wider community. And they have an opportunity to do so through, in some cases, not in all cases, through their marvellous architecture and their wonderful playing fields at a time when some schools have difficulty having sporting facilities. So I think this needs to be placed on the educational agenda, and I think politicians need to be constantly asked questions about this. But it's going to be difficult because they will want to dodge it, and the independent schools will want to keep their heads below the parapet. But it does get right into the question that Sheila asked about the wider social determinants of the state schooling system and how limits are set to what they can achieve because of this wider social and economic context.
Thank you very much, Walter. Now, Larry, of course, your members will span both sectors, I would have thought. So what's your view on this?
Well, we do have a policy position in relation to removal of charitable status in relation to the private sector. We do have members in the private sector as well. I think it's an interesting question, but as we heard this morning, the impact of social capital and a wealthy background is not confined to the private sector. I can take you to East Rent, I can take you to Jordan Hill in Glasgow and show you how people's social capital aids their children's success in school. Again, I'm putting success in inverted commas because I want to come back to how we actually define success. And politically, it's, you know, it'd be tempting just to go on a rant about private sector schools, epitomising the inequalities that exist in our society, and you know, being a key factor in continuing the existing scenario. I actually would prefer to spend my energy looking at what we're doing in our schools. I don't take the view that private schools are better than state schools. I take the view that private schools have a much more selected intake, where the impact, or you know, the positive impact of that affluent background plays out in the schools. But I think I know there is a lot of poor teaching practice in a lot of private schools. People paying tens of £1,000s a year to send their children to private schools and then still having to pay for tutors in relation to getting through the exams. And I'll not start, for reasons of confidentiality, on how private schools work or used to work the appeal system in relation to higher qualifications. But I think it is a slight distraction in terms of the agenda around what we should be doing in the state sector. And I realise Edinburgh is a kind of foreign country to me, you know, so I come here to work on a daily basis, but I live in Glasgow. And I think there's a whole range of issues around why private sector secondary education is so popular in Edinburgh, and some of it is clearly linked to the government function that exists here and you know, the range of personnel that work in the government. But I would actually want to focus more on what we're doing in the state sector, and I absolutely take the point that we should not dismiss the inequalities that arise out of the social inequities in our society. As a union, we've been running a campaign around the impact of poverty on attainment and educational success. The point I was trying to make earlier was, I do not think the benchmark for how we measure success should be higher qualifications. I also don't think the benchmark should be as a measure, but it's not a key measure in terms of how many children from deprived backgrounds get to higher education institutions, because that seems to be predicated on the notion that is the goal, that's the holy grail. When in actual fact, if we do value vocational education, then we should actually be looking at a whole range of forward pathways which are equally valid. Everyone in Scottish education still talks about the higher as the gold standard. So what is everything else if the higher is the gold standard? You know, we're implicitly saying to kids who don't get hires, you somehow have not achieved as well as others. And it's because we don't value vocational education in our school system. It's always been predicated on those who are not able to pass other qualifications. That's been your vocational stream, right back from even when it was non-cert classes.
So what would your answer be then?
Well, I think the answer lies...
No, what was your suggestion? I mean, the point that you've made about the fact that there is still that divide, and we do still see the higher as the holy grail, the university degree as the one to attain for.
Well, I think the answer lies in how we reshape the senior phase, and one of the questions that's posed in the book is the post-15 governance arrangements that we have to, and I was quite struck by the book identifying that we still think in terms of schools, institutions, rather than a system-wide approach. So between re-looking at the senior phase and how it's been implemented or not been implemented, and looking at the college sector, I think there is a potential scenario there for actually creating a genuinely comprehensive system in the post-15 scenario. One of the real benefits of the restructuring of the college sector is that it's moved colleges, I think, much more back into the public education arena. I'm not saying they were completely separate, but when we had incorporation and colleges moved away from local authority to control, they all kind of operated at their own level. I think we now have a much greater kind of public sector ethos around the college sector. And if we can marry that to what we do post-15 in terms of the senior phase, then I think what's hinted at in the book around looking at a different landscape post-15 could offer some opportunities around having a more genuinely equal social just post-15 system. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I'm not convinced around the baccalaureate, right, but there's a lot of work to be done there. But we are at a stage where the CFE Management Board, government, ourselves as a union, are looking at the senior phase and saying we've done very little in terms of the ambition. We've delivered the qualifications without disaster, but actually we need to kick on from here and get back to what the bigger picture was. And the colleges, I think, would be a vital part of that.
Thank you. I want to allow you time to come back on that question. So I wondered, Linda Averill, whether you wanted to add anything at this point?
Just one thing, that parents from private schools would phone me up to take their youngsters in to Anniesland College, as well as because they hadn't done well in the private school that they were in. The business of us sharing facilities with the private sector became very acute in terms of charitable status. My college was building a new college. We didn't have any facilities in terms of sports facilities. We provided NC, HNC and HND courses. And we worked in collaboration with local providers who were all the private sector. When I come to Edinburgh, I find it a bit strange at the proportion who go to private education. And dare I say, it's many people within education who also send their children there. I've always felt that my income came from the public sector and my children would be educated in the sector. Right.
Okay, I think Larry had one very quick point, and then I want to bring out.
It was just in response to Walter's suggestion that one of the ways that the private sector might justify charitable status is through more assisted places or scholarships. I would be totally against that. That suggests to me that private schools are somehow better. I would advise MD against that route.
Okay, Avril.
I'm going to be really brief, and I would say I am a product of the 96% that went to a comprehensive school. I'm very proud to be a head teacher and a Scottish rector of a very comprehensive secondary school with 85% of our young people in decils 1 to 5. And I would say that the experiences that our young people get are outstanding in terms of the quality of learning and teaching that goes on in our classes consistently on a daily basis. What I would pose is a question of really how resilient are those pupils at the end of the day, comparing young people from both the private and the comprehensive sector. And I think that's one of the questions that Danny, you raised in your previous book around what is the actual sustainability and longevity of young people once they leave post-school into further or higher education, what extent are they resilient within that, and the stickability of that, and what is the dropout rate by comparison. And I think that we do a very, very good job in the comprehensive sector to ensure that our young people do maintain in both further and higher education.
Thank you very much. Any views, any comments from yourselves listening to this? Please, yes. Oh, that's right. Thank you. No, it's not on.
Hi, sorry. My name is Jessica Schiller. I'm from the United States, and listening to this has been fascinating for me, so thank you for that. On the subject of private education, though, I wanted to say I'm from a city in the U.S. Where about a third of the students go to private schools. And the main problem with that, aside from what's been mentioned, is that the parents and the children that go to those schools really don't have to care about what goes on in the public schools, and don't generally, because they've opted out of that system, and we have sort of increasing privatization of public education in what are called charter schools in the U.S. as well. So I'm wondering if that's at all in your discussions when you think and talk about private education in Edinburgh specifically, but throughout Scotland, how to get the folks who are associated with those schools to care about what goes on in the rest of the schools, because without their impact and influence, it will be hard to make some of these policy and political changes.
It's a question that I'm going to leave hanging, Jessica, because I think it's a very big question, and I'm not sure that there are necessarily enough people in this room who might actually be able to answer that one, simply because they're not on that side of of sending their children there. I mean, might be making wrong judgments, but anyway, time moves on. Christina Iannelli. Now, this is an interesting question, because the question here that we've been thinking about schools, further education. The question now moves into employability, social mobility, and the labour market. So, Christina.
Thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation this morning. I enjoyed very much also Linda's presentation of data, which clearly is at the heart of my research as well. Linda showed us very clearly that comprehensive education has brought some equalization of educational outcomes, but this has happened at a compulsory level. When we look at primary, secondary, lower secondary, what we would call in international literature level, this doesn't seem to have had then a follow-on in the next level, which is the post-compulsory level, and because I've done a lot of research on social mobility, has not led to an equalization of occupational opportunities in the labour market. So my question is, what can be done to promote more equality at post-compulsory education level and also in the labour market?
Okay, Linda, I think I'm going to come to you first.
I think we've actually we've tried to do an awful lot, but we've got a labour market that's stratified itself. And that stratification goes back in. But in terms of women engineers, promotion of career opportunities, etc., real men care, and we see that in this panel today. We do a lot of we've not really spoken about careers education, but we do a lot of work earlier on in the school, actually letting people see the range of careers that's available for you as a person, rather than for you in terms of your gender or background. So I think there's a lot that we've got to do there, but still you'll come in to a college and you will see gender segregation in some of the choices that people have made. And that is a thing that we need to kind of work to. I think what we'd be looking at, I suppose maybe at the weekend I went to the suffragette movie, do you know what I mean? And I suppose 100 years ago I would have been in one of these places that wash clothes and kind of ironed. We've come a long way as women, but we've not come enough yet. But equally, I'm concerned about Scottish young men and boys, and that gap in terms of attainment. We need to have the best ambition for children in Scotland, no matter whether they're a boy or a girl. But we also need to be able to take the opportunities in employment and make them available to them. And in some communities, in some of the areas that I now work in Lanarkshire, there's I've come from working in an area of Glasgow that did have the Jordan Hill School, but equally had Drumchapel High and Govan High. So I did have a real mixture. But in terms of some of the villages in Lanarkshire that you're working in, the raising people's horizons in that, the school is absolutely critical, and so is the college, and so is the wider community. So I have a lot of sympathy with your question.
Okay, Avril.
It's very useful in terms of what's actually going on in my own school's current geographical context. Presently we have two of the largest employers in our town have recently closed their doors. Mm-hmm. So the unemployment rate within this new town has increased, as has the female entitlement for our young people has actually increased to almost 1 in 3 of our learners as a consequence of that. So it's something that's actually very close to my heart. And I think, as an educationalist, what we are doing in a local context is very much as a consequence of the Wood Commission and what we're doing within trying to bring the community and partnerships into the school and into the educational system to address the inequalities that we know exist. What we're actually doing, we're looking and researching, we're spending a lot of time actually researching into where our young people are actually going to in terms of their positive destinations. And a lot of that can quite often be a snapshot. So at one particular juncture, a school's destinations are captured, and it might be X percentage. But what we're now doing is we're actually doing a follow-up study with that, and we're trying to find longitudinally where those young people actually are, and that is starting to pay dividends. What we're then doing is we're trying to retrospectively target those young people working with our other sectors, including the colleges, including actually trying to bring young people back into our doors that have potentially left, and working with our business partners. Some of the kind of things that are actually going on currently in our schools are things like careers fairs. A lot of schools across different local authorities are using Careers Ready, and they're actually linking young people into business mentors, and that is becoming a familial thing where not only the young person but their parent and carer are actually invited into business partnership meetings with that employer, and the probability, it's actually been very successful in some of the schools that I've been in. These young people who have these then apprenticeships and internships, they are young people who come from a less affluent background. We're finding that over 90% of those young people are then patched into that employer. So there are lots of really, really good things happening on the ground, and I would say that they are being done with the best effort and a true effort to try and address both the educational inequality there, where we're targeting those young people in certain areas and domains, and we know who they are, but we're also trying to link them into something which is a more sustained, positive destination, but linked into employability.
Thank you very much. And very briefly, Larry and Walter, if you have anything, but Larry.
Yeah, I hope men are becoming more caring. Although I also went to see the Suffragette movie at the weekend, and as we were leaving, we went to the toilets, and the ladies' toilets always takes longer because of the queue. So I was standing there and beside two other guys who were clearly waiting for their partners, and their reaction to the movie went along the lines of, there wasn't much action in that film, was there? so maybe we're not making as much progress as we would hope. Very brief on the social mobility. There are two issues there, I think. One is, and it's touched on in the book, is that, and it goes back to your point around qualifications, that increasingly entrance to the job market is ratcheted up in terms of the requirements around qualifications. So my wife's a scientific officer in the NHS. When she left school with her hires, she started in work and went day release to college to build up qualifications. To enter that post now, you would need to have at least a degree, if not a postgrad qualification. So there's a barrier there, which goes back to academic success as a benchmark. And I think the other issue, just very quickly, is that the whole question around social mobility comes back to the issue of the impact of poverty and closing the attainment gap, because social mobility is only really possible if the jobs are there. You know, if our economy is actually working, so that there are opportunities for people. The government's announced the Attainment Challenge. There's money going to certain areas in Glasgow, and I can tell you now, in the 1980s, these areas were getting money because they were areas of priority treatment. So, you know, social mobility or then poverty can be an absolute barrier on a whole range of fronts, not just in school, on a whole range of fronts. And I think one of the difficulties for schools is that, you know, schools themselves cannot actually address these structural inequalities that are in society, and that's one of the walls that we keep banging our head against when we have these aspirations.
Very briefly.
I haven't seen the Suffragettes film. The most recent film I saw was Legend, which is about the Cray twins. And that brought some interesting social mobility between the East End of London and the highest levels of the Conservative Party. But I won't dwell on that. The serious point I wanted to make is about how effective people who already have social advantages are at maintaining those social advantages. And we can see this at post-school level very clearly through the Russell Group of Universities, for instance, through the deployment of various forms of capital in routes to employment, in social networking, for instance. And there is no easy answer to that. There is no single policy that's going to transform that. And if we have naive beliefs in human perfectibility, we are going to be disappointed. That is not to say that these issues shouldn't be addressed and constantly raised and challenged, and where we can make some progress, do it. But we're talking about a long-term game here. It's not easy.
Thank you. I want to go back to Christina for the last word, because you've been doing research in this area. You've heard now the panel's views. Any final comments on the question?
Well, the discouraging, I think, aspect of all this is that actually there has been a period of time in which there were a lot of jobs in the kind of most educated, professional managerial occupation, and even in that period, social mobility has been constant. There has not been any improvement. In terms of course, in absolute terms, we have clearly more people from lower social background getting into possibly higher education nowadays, fortunately enough, even though still in small proportions, and into good jobs. But there is something missing, in my opinion, which is what the operation of the labor market. Because even if they get higher education, it's harder for them to get those jobs than for the others. So I think there must be some way to link what happens in school and in higher education and what these people can then have access to afterwards. There may be a missing link between what employers do when they recruit and what actually people are prepared for when they complete their school or education in general or higher education.
Yes, indeed. I mean, schools, as Larry says, is not the only way. I mean, had we got time, I would have asked if there were any employers in the room and all that kind of stuff, but we don't, because actually I think the perception of who fits and who doesn't fit still needs to be asked. Time's running out, but I do actually want to have one final, so I'm sorry there are some people here whose questions won't be asked. And this goes to Diane Waters, and I would like the panel to give me very quick answers. So is Diane still here? Thank you, Diane. Very quick, very brief panel, because we've run out of time.
Yeah, a rather off-the-field question. What do the panel think about the architectural legacy of Scotland's, quote, box standard comprehensive school buildings of the 1960s and 70s? And has the negativity towards modern architecture impacted on parent and teachers' views of the system?
So it's an interesting one to end with. Yes, slightly off the wall, but Avril. Do you work in a bog standard?
I work in a bog standard school which will be 50 years old next year in 1966, and it's actually on the exterior it looks its age, but on the interior it's absolutely immaculate, and I would have to say that that is very much down to the school community. It's down to the people that actually look after that building and they keep it in a very, very good preserved way. And it's part of the cultural history of the community that, we actually invite the community into the school, and there are neighbours in the surrounding community that can tell you exactly when it was built, what it actually looked like. They've got, we're actually compiling a kind of social history of the school just now in preparation for the 50th anniversary, and there were the Celtic knots right around the school. So the actual architecture at the time was very much in line with Glenrothes being a new town and a new build and the kind of boom at that time. Some of that has gone, and some of the lustre on the outside has gone, but very much the community aspect of the school and the fact that the community are very much a part of coming into and supporting our school is very much still there and alive, and the people who work in the building are very, very proud of it too.
So not just what's inside, what's outside, it's what's inside, right?
I think the suggestion that 1960s schools are a bit of an embarrassment is in general true. They have been compared to factories, prisons and asylums, and you could develop those comparisons quite interestingly. I rarely say positive things about officialdom, but I have to report that I think the situation is getting better in relation to school design, and I base that on quite a wide range of examples. Just mention two very quickly. The school that I attended as a pupil, Eastwood High School in East Renfrewshire, has had a new build for about 2 years, and it's an excellent building. And I have been watching with interest the progress of the new Harris Academy in Dundee, which is nearing completion. And I haven't seen a lot of it, but what I do see looks quite promising. So a sort of 2 cheers for officialdom in relation to school buildings.
Okay, thank you, Larry.
Yeah, I attended yesterday the opening of the Riverside campus of the City of Glasgow College, which is a new build sitting beside its old 60s block, which is about to be demolished. And it's an absolutely fabulous building. It's a really excellent learning environment, well designed, with a high quality spec to the work. So I do think there are problems around tired buildings, and there may be some buildings. My old school, Hillhead High, is listed. So when it was refurbished, it had to basic character had to be maintained, which limits some of the adaptations that might be possible. So some buildings may well be worth preserving, but generally speaking, I think if we can have modern schools, a modern school estate, it will support teaching and learning. And there's some really good examples, not necessarily in Glasgow because its PPP project was rushed, but some of the more recent examples, Wallace High in Stirling that I spoke at a while back, absolutely brilliant school, well designed for all the kind of activities we like to see in a modern school. So I'm in favour of modernising the school estate unless there are, genuinely strong architectural reasons for retaining a historical building in a community.
Thank you. And finally, Linda?
I was in the Riverside, inspiring. I think the building should inspire us in learning. We all know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's an application of that. If you're in depressed circumstances in a school, how do you feel? We deal with a lot of people who are maybe coming back from mental illness problems. And when I get a new college, somebody said to me, all this light coming in, it just cheers you up coming into the building. And I think that is important. Some of the boxes, if they were designed by good architects, are really good because what it gives you is slightly more space than what you get in some of the modern schools. But I would be hoping that Scotland would continue to invest in its learning establishments and buildings. They did get it right sometimes, and in the past they definitely got it right. But what we need to do is to continue that. And remember, it's the tradesmen that I train that can help you deliver new education.
You clapped to the wonderful ending of the answer, but I want you to clap again for me and thank this wonderful panel. Thank yourself for the questions. Thank you. Now, we've got as a final time for reflection from Professor Tony Gallagher, Professor of Education, and also Pro VC for the Queen's University in Belfast. Danny's already given him a plug earlier that if you want to have 4,000 words and to understand a bit about this higher education and the schooling system in Northern Ireland, look at his chapter in the book. But Tony, can I ask you to address the audience? Would you need the lapel mic?
Let's just stay here.
Okay, thank you very much. What I did for preparation for this, I put together a few slides, which I'll run through fairly quickly, just showing some themes from our own system, and I've got some notes on the fascinating the presentations and discussion here. One of the things it's important to say is, well, thanks very much for inviting me to come along, and it was really good to be part of the book. I enjoyed being part of the process of the book, and I've enjoyed reading the book and learning from it. But it was refreshing this morning that right at the heart of the discussion was the notion of fairness as a key criterion. In Northern Ireland for about 15 years we've had a massive debate around the selective system that we operate. The debate has become a bit moribund in recent years, but there was an attempt in that debate to claim that fairness and excellence were trade-offs, even though we know from PISA evidence that fairness and excellence are both possible. But it was nice to hear a discussion where fairness was put right at the heart of the entire debate. In Northern Ireland, at a variety of different points in time, the selective system has been declared dead by a variety of people. And every time, like Rasputin, it comes back to haunt us. And it's still there, despite all these various attempts to try and remove. The most recent attempt was a decision by the Sinn Féin Minister of Education in 2008 to stop the official tests, so that there's no basis for selecting pupils, at which point 2 different consortia of grammar schools got together and created their own tests because there's no legal bar on academic selection. So whenever those of us who've been working on this issue for many years, at the start we wondered whether we would eventually see the end of the 11 plus and the end of academic selection. We've ended up with 2 11 pluses and academic selection as strong as ever. The research we did way back, it was published way back in 2000, and it sparked off the debate for a period. What we found was the sort of things that was found in previous research. There's no great surprises. The negative impact on primary schools, the negative impact on post-primary schools and the diversity and inequality which it produced, but also the impact it had on people's perceptions of education and reinforcing those sorts of divisions within the system. So there was no big shock in the evidence that came out of the looking at the effects of a selective system of post-primary education. One of the things we also discovered, it just reinforces a point that was made earlier and is made in the book, that when you have a selective system as opposed to a comprehensive system, you have a different distribution of schools. This graph just shows the distribution, categorises schools in terms of the performance. And you can see in Northern Ireland we have a bipolar distribution. The system helps to encourage high-performing grammar schools, but at the same time creates a long tail of relatively low-performing secondary schools. Whereas in the Scottish system, it's a very different pattern, and most of the variation is within schools rather than between them, albeit that creates its own issues, as we've heard at various points today. Since then, we've been grappling with fallen roles, and surprise, surprise, it's the secondary schools that bear the brunt of the consequences of fallen roles. The grammar schools, despite the fact of being academically selective, have continued to take into full capacity. So that because of that, the proportion of young people going into grammar schools has steadily increased over time. And it's interesting because in some senses they're becoming, in ability terms, and more diverse, but not in social terms. The sort of social differences between the schools are not changing that much at all, despite the sort of change in numbers going into them. What else have I got here? Yeah, this is an interesting one that it relates to a sort of a broader pattern about rise in qualifications. If you compare, this is comparing 1992 with 2012, looking at performance changes in different categories of schools. And you can see there's not much of a change in the grammar schools, but that's because they're already almost at a ceiling level. There have been quite dramatic changes in the secondary schools. And some people have argued that shows that selection doesn't matter anymore. It's okay because the secondary schools are now doing all right. Although for me, it sort of suggests the whole language of a differentiation between academic and non-academic kids just looks even more nonsensical in a context like that. But it does relate to another point that I want to come back later on. Some of the data we looked at earlier on looked at the gender patterns. There's a very similar pattern in Northern Ireland, and I think that suggests that the sort of gender patterns are more related to other changes rather than simply the structure of the schools. There were particular processes in the selective system that held girls back, and they were removed. But we still have a selective system, and the gender sort of profiles have gaps have opened up in the Northern Ireland system as well. And you can see this in other ways for the older age groups, or 3A levels, and you can see it also in terms of some changes in the patterns of where boys and girls are going after school, with particular increases in the number of girls going into higher education and over a number of years. This is an interesting one just because it highlights one of the consequences of retaining a selective system. Each of the dots is a school. The horizontal axis is the proportion of pupils in each of the schools entitled to free school meals. And the vertical axis is an attainment measure, the proportion of pupils in year 12 who got 5 or more good GCSEs. And there's a couple of things that are striking in this. First of all, the little cluster of schools or dots at the top left-hand corner of the grammar schools. Relatively high performance, relatively low levels of social disadvantage. But one of the most striking things is the size of the cloud, if you like, of secondary schools. Huge variation in social circumstances and challenge that the schools are dealing with, and huge variation in outcomes. The colours just represent an issue which isn't of direct significance here around denominational differences. The blue schools are Catholic schools, and the red schools are Protestant schools. And there's an interesting issue has arisen because the performance levels in Catholic schools in Northern Ireland are now higher than the performance levels in Protestant schools, a reverse from what the situation was 25 to 30 years ago. But this graph is really just about showing the huge degree of variation that you get in a system that builds diversity, that sort of structural diversity and inequality into the arrangements. You can see this as well looking at the social profile, whether you look at the entitlement to free school meals, whether you look at the proportion of the pupils who are in a special needs register, or going back to the issue about fallen roles, the proportion of unfilled places in the schools. In a situation where things are going wrong, it's the kids at the bottom of the pile who have to bear the full brunt and the consequences of that. So the unfairness which is built into the structure of the system is simply reinforced by the way in which these change processes are being dealt with. And this is the last graph before I say a few words reflecting some of the things that I heard today. And this is just again looking at social achievement gaps, the difference in performance levels between all pupils and pupils who are entitled to free school meals using a variety of different measures. 5 or more good GCSEs, 7 or more good GCSEs. But interestingly, the gap is widest whenever you look at more of a sort of a basket of qualifications. You look at 5 or 7 GCSEs, but include having a qualification in English or maths. In those situations, the gaps are widest. And I think one of the problems in the way in which the achievement gap has been talked about in Northern Ireland is that on some measures it looks like the achievement gap is narrowing. But that's only if you focus on achievement measures where the grammar schools or the more affluent pupils are already at a ceiling. And inevitably, as time goes on, because of the rising curve of qualifications, inevitably that gap is going to narrow. But if you look at measures where the ceiling isn't there, the gap is continuing to widen. I think that's quite important. Now, in terms of the discussion today, one of the things that I quite liked about the book and I quite liked about the framework that was set up at the start of today was the way in which it set this sort of overarching framework around trying to achieve a balance between liberty, equality and fraternity. Because the comprehensive approach, the comprehensive ideal was originally based on a number of core principles, including the principle of localism and the principle of uniformity. And a lot of the discussion in the book, a lot of the discussion here has been trying to deal with some of the consequences, the potential consequences of moving away from some of those foundational principles and worrying about what might happen if you start to move away from some of those foundational principles and what protections you need to try to build into the system to mitigate any of those sorts of effect. And there's two main challenges that particularly struck me in a lot of the discussion today, a lot of the presentations today, at either end of the system, if you like. One of them is how you deal with the challenge that not all children come to school from the same position. They're not starting from the same position. And how do schools deal with that reality in terms of what they provide? And then at the other end of the system, how do you deal with the challenge that the outcomes from school are not all equally valued? And because they're not all equally valued, the school in the post-compulsory period starts to perform some sort of a selective function at sorting young people out for getting into those different routes. So the first of those challenges, the challenge of social background, if you like, or the challenge of trying to deal with the consequences of social disadvantage. This is something that's a huge issue for us. It's clearly an issue here. One of the things which I had noted down and came up then right in the very end of the panel session, this challenge isn't just an educational challenge, and it's not something which can be solved or addressed by schools alone. It seems to me that the principle of fraternity and the way that reminds us of the importance of community is something that has to play an important role in this particular instance. We've had many projects in different parts of Northern Ireland, all trying to address this issue around social disadvantage. Endless amount of money poured into these projects, and fundamentally nothing ever seems to change. As a direct consequence of frustration with that process, in one area of Belfast, in the Shankill Road, it's a highly disadvantaged Protestant inner city community. They've been working on this for years. They've been chasing project money for 2 and 3 and 4 year projects, which they put in place, and the money ends, they've got to chase more money. But those sorts of short-term approaches are never, ever, ever going to solve those sorts of problems. So what they've done in the Shankill is to declare a children and young people zone. They've tried to pull in what support and resources they can from the schools, from government departments, from businesses, from the FE colleges, from the universities, and from the community networks. And they've set themselves a 20-year challenge to transform the life chances of a generation of young people. And they want all these different groups to sort of work with them, and we're happy to work with them in trying to deal with that. But it's that sort of approach that's needed. Sometimes you need a very focused approach that tries to draw on the full resources that are available within a community, within a society, to address some of these problems. Rather than assuming that if you tinker with the curriculum, or you're tinkering with support for particular educational issues, or you tinker with something else, that somehow or other the problem will solve itself. There's no sort of sense that that's going to happen. The second challenge, the challenge of unequal outcomes. And the very strong theme in the book and in the presentations earlier today, that this challenge can have quite significant consequences for post-compulsory education in the comprehensive system here, and some of the ways that it operates. Again, there was a couple of themes came through. It struck me particularly on this. One is and again it came up in the panel discussion, is the relative status of academic and vocational qualifications. Because it seems to me that the status is to a certain extent dependent on the outcomes or the availability of valuable outcomes. We know from work in other places, or we know, suppose in some senses there's always this sort of fear or concern that vocational qualifications are always going to be seen as second best, because they're trying to make up for something that people sort of can't get. But if you look at countries which have highly regarded and well-established vocational qualifications, it actually turns out there's an interesting difference in the way that they operate, and compared to some of the patterns that you saw on the graph I was showing earlier on. Where you don't have highly regarded and sort of well-established vocational qualifications, then the amount of qualifications you get becomes sort of the issue in itself. And it doesn't matter if qualifications are rising. If they're rising for everyone, all that happens is the bar to get into an opportunity rises. And so there's almost a built-in grade inflation in terms of qualifications. But if you have well-established and well-regarded vocational qualifications that lead to employment opportunities, then you get to a certain threshold level, and an employer knows you know what you need to know. And it doesn't matter if you've got a level above that. The qualification actually has merit in its own terms. And I'm not sure we're at a situation like that where we are. And so they sort of, again, thinking around a little bit with vocational qualifications as a sort of an alternative doesn't really solve some of the bigger problems, because that system of grade inflation continues to operate. And so all that happens is that the barrier gets higher, even though in sort of in absolute terms people think things are improving. So there's a whole issue around that, and about how we try to establish sort of well-regarded, well-established vocational qualifications. And then beyond that, there's a whole question about how we go beyond the narrow focus on qualifications itself, because sometimes, certainly this is one of my beefs in the Northern Ireland education system, sometimes you get the impression, listening to people, that the sole purpose of education is to squeeze as many GCSE or A levels out of a young person as possible, which seems to be to lose sort of sight of the part of the whole point of education. There were a number of interesting ideas that have emerged in the sort of the thinking out of the book and in the presentations around trying to identify a wider range of pathways. The notion of a graduation certification or certificate is a way of allowing for recognising a wider range of contributions that young people could make. It was an interesting idea. But in Northern Ireland, we're sort of approaching this in a slightly different way, maybe because of different circumstance. Diversity is an inevitable part of our system. We have a selective system. It's changing because of demographics, but there's not going to be any big sort of structural change in the foreseeable future. We also have a denominationally divided system, and we have Irish medium schools, we have integrated schools, Catholic and Protestant schools. So we have a diverse school system, and we're not going to get away from that. Pursuing an attempt to try and reduce that level of diversity may be desirable, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So what that has done is caused us in some areas to start to rethink how we imagine schools. We've moved away from thinking of schools as a system of autonomous units, each responsible for their own destiny and sort of looking after their own destiny, but rather to see schools as part of an interdependent network, where things that happen in one school have consequences for other schools, whether that's good or bad. Once you start to think of schools as part of an interdependent network, then you can start to look for network solutions to try and solve some of these problems. And a network solution is really about trying to get people within schools to accept that they have some degree of responsibility for all the young people in the area where the school is based, not just responsibility for the young people who happen to be in their school. And can you connect schools in some way that you can get people to think like that? And that's what we've been doing in a shared education project, where and it's largely driven by ways of trying to address the denominational divide, where we effectively left the institutional divisions between young people in place, but made those divisions porous, or those barriers porous, and have young people moving between schools to take classes, and teachers moving between schools to take classes, and trying to create a different dynamic in the relationship between the people in the schools and the parents and the wider communities. And there's some interesting things that have come out of that, in particular in relation to teacher empowerment and bottom-up approaches and innovation to try and to create educational change. And we've linked it into a school improvement agenda as well. And I just offer it as an idea that has got some resonance in our context as a way of allowing diversity to exist, but mitigating some of the negative consequences of diversity. It's a bit like trying to create cooperative interdependencies, deliberately trying to create cooperative interdependencies as a way of promoting educational change. And another part of the discussion today reminded me of Neil Postman's book. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, called The End of Education. And one of the things that I always found fascinating about Postman's book was that what he was doing was looking at the social role of US public schools. And to cut a long story short, one of the key themes in his book and his examination of the social role of US public schools was that in relation to the sort of questions that we're talking about, what he said, there's not an answer to these issues, but there are many answers, and the answers change over time. Because as a number of people have said, education and society is a constantly evolving system. In our context, we're trying to find ways to build a cohesive society. And using education as part of a process of building a cohesive society. The ways in which we thought was the appropriate way to do that has changed over time. The mores or values or assumptions about the best way to achieve it has changed over time. And we should just accept that. There isn't an answer, there isn't a silver bullet to these things. But what we should be trying to do is look at the way in which look at our best understanding of what we can do at any particular point, and be prepared to change as our understanding of these things sort of moves on. And that's where an idea that is in the book and was mentioned again in the presentation earlier today around the notion of a civic conversation. I was very struck talking last night at dinner when we were talking about this, the way in which there isn't a sort of a sense of a big picture understanding or conversation in Scotland about what people want out of education. A sort of a big strategic framework to establish the key principles and values that you want people to, young people to get out of the time that they spend in education. Because we know there are many different purposes to education. It's to do with individual mobility, it's to do with enhancing human capital, it's to do with enhancing social cohesion, it's to do with enhancing social and cultural capital as well. So there's many, many different goals. But if you have an agreed set of goals, an agreed set of ideas, an agreed criteria for what you want out of education, then you can use that as a framework for judging how well you're doing at any particular point in time, and for judging the impact of any changes that you put into place. So rather than saying, how can we sort of explore issues around diversity and set criteria for diversity, have criteria for education. If you want to implement some diverse practices, then see what the consequences are then for the bigger picture. And if it's good, do it. If it's not, then change it. And again, set the bigger criteria for the way in which you want to address these things. So having that civic conversation, that sort of big understanding of what education is for and what as a society Scotland wants to get out of it, could be the basis in which you actually have a framework for judging all the little things rather than trying to solve each little thing separately. So maybe that's an idea worth trying. Thank you.
I don't know how you did it, Tony, but you have phenomenal summing up and reflection, giving us food for thought from your own neck of the woods, but actually, I think, giving us now the little nuggets to go forward with. I think they're kind of all there, but you've captured it into very workable action points for us. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of our team here very, very much for that summing up. Thank you. I've got one more job for you, and then it's lunch. And the job is that you will have in your pack Post-its. Now, if you can, there are two things. One Post-it for what's been the key lesson that you think the last 50 years has taught us. So this key lesson. And the second Post-it is what's the key challenge? What's the challenge for us for the comprehensive school system of the future? Now, when you have those Post-its, if you could then take them outside, if you've got them, there's a sheet as you come out on the right-hand side, put it up there. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take all these Post-its, your lessons and your challenges, and we'll put them up on the Centre for Educational Sociology's website, so we get a kind of feel of what this group of people are saying. So once you've done that, you can go for lunch. Now, I would like to thank the speakers, the panelists. They didn't know the questions beforehand. They were pretty much answering just as the questioner was asking that, and I think that's a real achievement. It just shows how much they know their own areas and how passionate they are of their own work. I'd like to thank Creed for the work that the Centre has done in supporting the organising of this event, and in particular to Grace, who's disappeared. She's gone outside. So somebody tell her that she's been formally thanked. To Barry Barretto for actually arranging all the live streaming and the video footage, so it's archived, it's part of the history and for us to look at and for others. And also to Colin Campbell, who's been running around trying to make sure that the Minister doesn't trip on the building works outside and gets here. So, but my final thanks is actually and if I've missed anybody else out, please excuse me, but consider yourself thanked. And my final thanks actually goes to each and every one of you, some of whom have come from a long distance to be here, and others I know rejigging their diaries and teaching commitments, etc. So thank you to each of you very, very much, and please enjoy lunch. Thank you.